Yonker?
Here.
Verheulen?
Here.
Singh?
Present.
Shore? Kniezek?
Here.
Lipton? Zemke?
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have quorum.
Thank you. Also need a motion to for excused absences for Representatives McMillan, Shore, and Lipton.
So moved. Support.
So moved by Pagel.
Got it.
Also need a motion for adoption of minutes. The last meeting. Also, Representative Pagel. We have a full schedule this morning. I know that several of you have put in cards requesting to speak or not speak. We'll hope to try and get to those if at all possible. I think our best chance, though, for public testimony will probably come the next meeting on the 14th and on the 28th. Nevertheless, again, we'll try to get to them. Also, I'd like to just remind the committee that single questions, if possible. I know last meeting we had allowed multiple follow-up questions by individual representatives, and I think that for purposes of time and that we need to keep those as short as possible to allow others to get in. With that, we'll call up our first presenter, and that would be Joy Pullman with the Heartland Institute. Joy, welcome. If you turn on the red button there in front of your microphone. Take it away.
Thank you, Chairman Kelly, for the invitation to speak today, and to those assembled for your time and attention. I'm Joy Pullman. I'm an Education Research Fellow at the Heartland Institute and a mother of 3 children, one of whom you can see when I stand up. Michigan is where my grandparents met and raised 5 children outside of Detroit. My mother, aunts, and uncles were born here. My aunt has been a public school counselor here, and my uncles, cousins, and grandfather have made countless rounds as Michigan policemen and women. I attended Hillsdale College here, and this is where I met my husband and where we became engaged. It is a beautiful state that has given me many of life's greatest blessings, and I am always glad to return. The Heartland Institute is a nationwide, state-focused think tank that researches and promotes ideas that empower individuals. I speak for myself as we believe in intellectual freedom. Today, I will outline the main arguments against Common Core, both from Michigan and around the nation. These include a loss of state sovereignty and local autonomy, low academic quality, dangers to student privacy, and subverting the central reason that public education exists. My testimony is heavily footnoted and will be available through Representative Kelly's office if anyone wishes to check my facts or look for more information, and some will be surprising, I think. Governor Snyder believes that Common Core originated with lawmakers, but he is misinformed. Private organizations created the initiative and continued to control it throughout the Common Core development process. In 2007, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation commissioned a report on the future of No Child Left Behind, which called for national education standards. In May 2008, the Gates Foundation then awarded the Hunt Institute $2.2 million to promote national standards, especially to state governors and lawmakers. The Hunt Institute then began partnering with the National Governors Association to target state leaders with its national standards message. In December 2008, NGA, the Council of Chief State School Officers and Achieve Incorporated, released a report calling for national standards. It recommended a strong federal-state partnership to achieve this goal. These 3 groups then answered their own call and coordinated Common Core. Their efforts were underwritten once again by the Gates Foundation. The list of people who sat on Common Core committees is long, but the people who controlled the outcome were few. Committee members told me they had no power over the standards. That was reserved to the standards' 5 lead writers, of whom none live in Michigan, none have been K-12 teachers, and 2 had never written standards. Although Common Core shepherds requested public comments, they never published these or responded to them publicly, which is typically required for public rulemaking. The NGA and CCSSO are private, Washington, D.C.-based trade organizations. Unlike state boards of education and legislatures, their activities are not subject to open records requests or open meetings laws. Common Core was created entirely in private, and its contributors signed confidentiality agreements. NGA receives approximately 80% of its funds from the federal government according to its tax documents, and CCSSO receives approximately half of its funds from the federal government. Furthermore, Americans already have state-led mechanisms for instituting new policies. We call these state legislatures and the U.S. Congress. Private groups are free to dream up whatever they wish, but not to cover their attempts to control public policy with a veneer of political and legal legitimacy. State legislatures, and here in Michigan, of course, also the State Board of Education, are the only bodies constitutionally granted power over K-12 education, not governors and state superintendents with powerful whims. Even so, NGA and CCSSO looped governors and state superintendents into signing a complete education restructure without the consent of the legislature or state board through memorandums of agreement committing their states to the Common Core project and subsequently to national Common Core tests. The second agreement clearly subordinates Michigan's legislature to the National Common Core Testing Group it has joined, Smarter Balanced. It commits the state to address barriers in state law, statute, regulation, or policy to implementing the proposed assessment system. I'll have more to say about these agreements later. Lawmakers, business leaders, and the public must understand that there is simply no evidence on which to base claims bandied about here in Michigan that Common Core standards are necessary to improve learning. None. When people, such as the Detroit Free Press editorial board, Jeb Bush, or the business leaders for Michigan state Common Core will benefit children, you must demand that they provide evidence. They have done, besides talking points sponsored by the Gates Foundation and the federal government. Yes, both have paid for Common Core public relations campaigns. It would insult religion to call Common Core a matter of blind faith. A series of data analyses from the left-leaning Brookings Institution finds no link between high state standards and student achievement. Many nations whose students outperform ours on international exams have national standards, but the same is true of countries that perform far worse. In short, no research supports the idea that common standards and tests benefit children. Michigan should have learned about this through working with Achieve's American Diploma Project, through which it and 34 other states have been working to update their standards and tests. 8 years later, we have Achieve back telling Michigan what a rotten job they did, leading Michigan's pursuit of better standards and tests, because the outcomes of Michigan students are still pretty lame. So the answer is more Achieve-led coalitions of states changing their standards and tests. A competent sales team can get you to think you need what they're selling, and that's what has happened. The result has been a perversion of states' legal systems and the usurpation of authority over education by outside special interests who believe bigger is better and central control by technocrats is best, contrary to all economic and socio-political evidence and experience showing otherwise. Economist Milton Friedman and sociologist James Q. Wilson definitively show, if the USSR did not, that planned economies mangle humans. Since I understand that you will again hear from English language arts expert Dr. Sandra Stotsky, I will leave her to discuss the quality of Common Core dictates on that subject. So I will discuss its math, which is nowhere near rigorous or internationally benchmarked, according to people involved with and independent of the Common Core project. Give me a second to catch my breath here. Breathing for two sometimes makes it harder for me to say a lot in a long period or a short period of time. Dr. William Schmidt of Michigan State University has repeatedly presented state legislators deceptive explanations of his research on Common Core math. To quote Zev Werman, a contributor to California's previous math standards, which were among the best in the nation, Schmidt and his co-author Huang's own data do not support their claim that the topic progression in the Common Core math standards are similar to the progressions of the TIMSS A+ countries, those are our international competitors, nor that states that did better on the NAEP, the well-respected U.S. test, had standards more closely aligned with Common Core. Further, their claim of coherence and hierarchy for the Common Core is achieved only by reshuffling Common Core content coverage charts so they seem to look like those of successful nations. The actual research that these two did shows that Common Core at most matches top international math standards approximately 56%. It also shows that the standards of states that perform poorly on the National Assessment of Educational Progress are much more aligned with Common Core math than the math standards of top NAEP achievers. The two repeatedly shuffle data to get the conclusions they've been foisting upon state policymakers, moving standards out of one grade into another until they all magically seem to align. I don't know if my PowerPoint is able to come up in a moment, but until it does, there are a couple of slides that kind of show you the comparison where Dr. Schmidt and his colleagues changed their own data in order to get the conclusions that I just mentioned, rather than taking the data as it is, which presents a different picture of the Common Core math compared to international math standards. So I don't see that, so I'll just continue and perhaps go through it if it shows up. Let's talk about the math aside from Dr. Schmidt. Compare Common Core math to that recommended by the acclaimed program initiated by Dr. E.D. Hirsch called Core Knowledge. As early as kindergarten, Core Knowledge students encounter money in math class, while Common Core students don't until 2nd grade. In 2nd grade, Core Knowledge students begin learning multiplication, which Common Core delays until 3rd grade. By 6th grade, Common Core students are still learning multiplication, which Core Knowledge says is far too late. To quote their materials, they say by 5th grade in countries like Japan or France, students are already at work on a sophisticated curriculum, quite different in its demands from their work in 3rd and even 4th grade. Students still learning multiplication facts in 4th grade will not be prepared for such demands. This quality gap between the two only widens as students age. This is why Stanford University mathematician Dr. R. James Milgram, who was the only math content expert on Common Core's final review committee, refused to sign his name to Common Core. He says, thank you. He says, by the end of 5th grade, the material being covered in arithmetic and algebra in core standards is more than a year behind the early grade expectations in most high-achieving countries. By the end of 7th grade, core standards are roughly 2 years behind. Johns Hopkins University math professor and Common Core Math Feedback Committee member W. Stephen Wilson says the math standards of California, Florida, Indiana, Washington State, and Washington, D.C. are clearly better than Common Core's. Indeed, one of the 2 Common Core lead writers in mathematics, Jason Zimba, told the Massachusetts Board of Education Common Core graduate students prepared for a non-selective community college. There's also evidence that Common Core, the things that they label algebra and geometry, omit essential algebra and geometry content. I can just show you a few things. This figure 1 is the kind of description that Dr. Schmidt gives of how well Common Core matches international math standards. I think that the international ones are the dots and the Common Core is the shaded one. And then he reshuffled the topics in order to make Common Core looks like it matches the TIM standards right here. So this is the reshuffling. These topics here on the left, though, the words, they don't go into the grade band that he says that they do. He moved them around to make it look like it's an orderly progression all the way up to 8th grade. And then if you unshuffle it and you actually take the two to look like they do in their original way, you see the disassemblage of them where they don't match each other. And that's where we get Dr. Schmidt's own 56% correlation number. And so to further illustrate that shows the TIMS, the international standards, highlighted, and now Common Core beneath doesn't look comparable or orderly and coherent. And this is, of course, Dr. Schmidt's own data. Okay, so we're going to move on and turn to the last area of major concern, which is testing and data collection. A Common Core absolutely requires data collection on students, despite what Achieve's Michael Cohen told you earlier this month. Although Achieve coordinated the writing of Common Core and now runs one of the national Common Core testing groups, perhaps he hasn't read its voluminous agreements. Some are more than 1,200 pages long, but I've read them. These documents reveal that Common Core is not merely standards. The Memorandum of Understanding that governors and state superintendents signed to start Common Core envisions the project as standards plus common assessments. Those assessments and the related agreements place not just state sovereignty, but student privacy at risk. Michigan has promised to send unspecified student-level data to National Common Core Testing Group Smarter Balanced, which will enter, and I'm quoting from their materials, a centralized data repository where all student responses and professional development materials will be housed, and all test results and other information will be generated and reported. Smarter Balanced runs its own day-to-day operations, and big decisions are made by the 21 states on its governing board. Another mechanism that places control of Michigan's testing and data policies outside Michigan, and again unaccountable to the taxpayers who are paying for all of this. By the way, Smarter Balanced has not publicly specified its student data policies. Its counterpart, PARC, the other national testing group, is slated to come out with their own policies next year, the same year that the tests go into effect. Once Michigan student data reaches the Smarter Balanced national database, Smarter Balanced has agreed to provide timely and complete access to any and all data collected at the state level to the U.S. Department of Education or any government or research agency that the federal government designate. I call this the student data pipeline. Once the federal government can access that data, recent changes to federal student privacy law mean that student information can go literally anywhere. In 2012, the U.S. Department of Education rewrote the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act to say that it or any educational agency, such as a state or school, may share student information with anyone the agency wants without consulting or notifying parents. A great deal more information about children is being entered into Michigan's expanding data systems that are now open to Smarter Balanced. According to its 2009 federal grant application, Michigan is working to interconnect PK-12, post-secondary, and workforce data systems. The state is also connecting data from assessment, special education, the Michigan Department of Human Services, and career and technical education systems. The State Department of Education wants to still fill these databases, this data includes electronic transcripts for all high school students that will be stored indefinitely. The State Department of Education wants to fill these databases also with student financial aid information and ACT testing results as well. I don't know if you've ever filled out a college financial aid application, but it essentially encompasses a family's entire finances. It's kind of like a copy of your tax return. Michigan told the federal government that it would use stimulus funds to create compatibility with the National Center for Education Statistics data model. This data model includes 416 data points on individuals, including invasive subjects like their family religion, their voting status, bus schedules, medical records, and more. And while Michigan uses randomly generated student identification codes in the Internet era, this is no longer a secure way to keep a large file of individual data anonymous. To connect education databases to Michigan's workforce systems, the state plans to connect student identification numbers to their Social Security numbers. That guarantees that student records lose their anonymity. Even without Social Security numbers, the amount of information in these growing student files means anonymity is impossible because no two have the same data profiles, according to researcher Richard Innes. This multiplication of highly sensitive student information sent out to people that are not under parent control or individual control sets up several sets of databases that are extremely attractive to hackers, beyond placing it far beyond the hands of its rightful owners. The whole point of these data initiatives and of Common Core is to, this is a quote, accelerate the transitions of thousands of workers into good-paying jobs through relevant post-secondary training or education, according to the Michigan Department of Education. In short, the entire Common Core system is aimed to create a factory-style economy where you input small children at one end and get worker drones out the other, carefully pruned to fit the workforce slots laid out for them by the central planners of a managed economy. Consider the mantra of a Common Core, college and career ready. It contrasts with what the Michigan Constitution cites as the reason for the state's public education system. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. That's it. Odd, we never hear anything about good government or happiness in regard to Common Core. Perhaps they didn't study Michigan's Constitution. Michigan's people knew as recently as 1963, when the Constitution was amended, that the purpose of education is not narrow workforce training that benefits few, especially in a world where the fastest growing jobs for today's kindergartners do not even exist yet. Taxpayers fund education because constitutional republics demand self-governing citizens. Any education system that does not seek to graduate citizens cannot graduate good workers either. I believe that the Hillsdale contingent you have testifying today will speak more about this. How can Michigan do well by its students without relinquishing its constitutional autonomy over education to unaccountable private interests and the federal government, neither of whom are legal authorities in this regard? Simple. Michigan could upgrade its own standards and testing above Common Core. As Dr. Wilson noted, several states had already done so. To accommodate reasonable concerns that teachers have about jettisoning their work preparing for Common Core, give them an overlay of Common Core compared to the new and better Michigan standards. Virginia has done that without adopting Common Core. Common Core is not only an unproven experiment in which Michigan children are unwitting guinea pigs, it gives parents and communities no place to go with their concerns about education because it controls education through bureaucrats and commissions they pay but didn't elect and can't demand answers from. Anyone who has been educated for self-government and knows a little bit about history and American citizenship can see Common Core restrains the people's rights and liberties, and as such, it should be abolished. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right, I'm not a teacher. All right, my experience on education school board and tons of reading I've been doing on this Common Core, I thought it was a very simple issue. I was involved, however, when Governor Engler became involved with the Common Core while I was on the school board, and we were looking at it. So I have a ton of questions on some of the claims you made, but I don't, for sake of time, I can't go there, but I hope you have data backing up some of your claims.
Please start with my testimony to see the footnotes in the original document.
Yeah, I have some concerns on some of your comments. So we have some statements that the department said and things you said, and someone isn't giving us straight answers. So I hope you can back up what you're bringing forward as well as the department can, because I will be checking that out. But I want to go back to you made a comment that committee members told me that we had no power with the standards of this Common Core as a state. And now the department claims differently. So where do you get your information as to who was on those committees and who wasn't? This goes back a long time.
I think the difference there is perhaps how you and I define power, or perhaps they and I define power. So, of course, there was input from people in Michigan. I know, I've seen the list of the folks on the committees, and I checked it, to see who on Michigan was involved. But when I talked to the people on those very same committees that participated with them, they told me what they would do is, send their comments into the Central Common Core, folks, so that when I mentioned those 5 lead writers, those were the ones who decided what comments they would listen to and how they would listen to and incorporate those into the final standards. So basically, the people sitting on the committees were, like I said, they had input. They could, make comments, but those comments, they had no control over how weighty those comments were in the minds of the people who actually wrote in Common Core.
All right, I read that information that you're referring to. So we have a Common Core that you said was started by private funding, and private funding, which was in private entities, because there was a business picture of how are we as a nation going to approach the world market that we were moving into, all right? And so education, at its conception, back with President Lincoln, was developed around the North because we're an industrialized area of the country. And we wanted to train our children to be able to pick up what we were learning and growing into as an industrial nation. And it worked very well. So here we see the same format starting to play out. Am I wrong in this vision and what's happening? And if it's bad, why is that so bad?
Well, it's very obvious that education has economic consequences. But the point is, if you go back further than Lincoln to, for example, the Northwest Ordinance, in which the U.S. Constitution, I think it was 1787, the 1700s, late 1700s, it was the first that the U.S. Congress mentioned education. They talked about, supporting, one of the things was for industry, to continue in the states. But my point was that when you focus narrowly on, the economy as the only means of education, when all of the state constitutions, the whole reason that they give for the existence of education subsidies in the first place is to create, perpetuate a functioning republic, self-governing republic. If you're only focusing on the workforce training aspects of that, especially when you mention a fast-moving global economy, where, like I said, children today, when they graduate from college, they will enter an entirely different economy that may demand different skills. So you can't anticipate that. But what you can do is train children for the what used to be known as the liberal arts, where they are well-rounded, well-educated to self-govern and to teach themselves to learn. And that produces both a good citizen and a good worker.
Mr. Chair, one question. The standards, the Common Core standards, are a guideline for a national, a statewide, so the country as a whole is on a way of thinking on what information our children should be learning, and most of that's driven through economics. Is it not true that our state standards, our current state benchmarks, do not supersede this Common Core? That if a school district, if there's parts of our state standards that is a higher level than the Common Core, that our state standards can stay. Is that not true?
So I am not a content expert, which is why I quoted them, in my testimony. But from what I understand, Michigan could stand to improve its standards in overall, which is why I recommended that you do so and follow the lead of states that we already know have better standards than Common Core, rather than reverting to a poor Michigan system or a poor national system.
But my question was, if the state standard is of high quality, it should not, the Common Core should not be, we should not be teaching in our schools less than what we deem as a good standard with our state standard. So if the Common Core standard is lesser, it's there as a base. It is not there as a final standard. Our state standard would trump that if it's a higher standard, correct?
I don't know. As far as I understand, Common Core replaces your state standards unless your state Department of Education adds them. But the ones that the state adds would not be on the national test. And as you know, schools are very driven by funding and performance measures to clear the bar on that test at a very low base level.
Representative, we need to move on.
Yeah.
Representative Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll try to follow your directions here. Biggest curiosity, has the Michigan legislature ever voted on standards?
Well, there are some funding mechanisms that I believe in this recent, in the 2013 legislature that you put in, especially for the state tests and so forth. But I'm pretty sure the state legislature has never voted on the standards at all. But it tends to be the State Board of Education's job.
Correct. Though that's what seems to be happening. There seems to be, everybody is making comparative things and stating that, well, we never had a say. Well, we don't have a say in regard to, I can't find any information, and if somebody can, when they come forward, can enlighten me, I can't find where we have ever voted on standards.
I think that this would require a legal scholar that, in Michigan's Constitution, but I'm pretty sure that there's kind of a reciprocal relationship between the two in the Constitution, where the state legislature essentially delegates its education authority to the state board, but that doesn't mean that you have no authority over education whatsoever. For example, you particularly control the funding of schools and so forth.
Okay, thank you very much.
Representative Verheulen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for your testimony. I just have two very quick questions. At our last hearing, I had asked some questions regarding local districts, because I'm a big proponent of local district control, and I was told that local school districts in Michigan, whether public or non-public, are not required to use Common Core standards. Would you disagree with that?
Yes, and the reason is that they are required to administer state tests. So if those state tests are according to the Common Core standards, they are at a disadvantage if they do not do what will help their children perform well on those tests.
Right, but they're not legally out. Their students would, if the standard is based on Common Core, their students might perform less, but there's no compulsion for a local district to design a curriculum based on Common Core standards.
Yes, there is, through the testing mechanism.
Right. Okay. Second question, and I've been talking to superintendents and school board members and teachers and parents in my district, and there's a clear majority of the folks I've talked to who said that the Common Core standards, they're not perfect, but they're superior to the existing standard. And that's shared by other public policy organizations, including the Mackinac Center. And I think you're kind of saying that in your statement, where you say Michigan could upgrade its own standards and testing above Common Core. So are you in agreement with the folks in my district that are saying, yeah, Common Core standards aren't perfect, but when we look at Common Core standards, comparing it to the previous or existing standards, we think, and they didn't say because we want our students to perform well. They're saying we think it's better standards. So they're not getting into the discussion about federal control of education or data privacy and so on, but they're saying just looking at the standards themselves, my local educators are saying they're better than what we currently have. Would you disagree with that? Sounds like you do agree.
There are two
proposing to make ours better.
Right. So since I mentioned I'm not a content expert, I rely on the people like you do who can analyze that and give some evidence. So what I have heard is the same thing from those folks.
It seems like
My last point about that is just, why would you give some kids something that you know is mediocre when you could give them something that you know is the very best available?
No, and I don't disagree with that. I'm just trying to where we stand today in 2013. It seems like there's a consensus that the Common Core standards, regardless of their history history and the federal implications and the privacy implications are superior to what we've previously used. And that just seems to be a pretty broad consensus among educators and school board members and so forth. And it sounds like that's consistent with what you're hearing in Michigan as well.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Zemke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for coming in today. I just have a very quick question. I want to make sure that I have these citations correct. On your figures 1, 2, and 3, where are your citations for these?
These pictures come from Dr. Schmidt's own paper. So the paper that he presented that would compared Common Core to Tim's, these figures are from him. And the highlighting here was done by Zev Werman, the fellow that I quoted. But you can find these, right in Dr. Schmidt's own paper, these figures that are up here on the PowerPoint.
And can you just aid me in telling me which source that is? You have a very substantial list of sources.
I do. Let's see here. Here we go. I don't think it's in my paper because I didn't mention it in my paper, but if you'd like, I can email you the copy of his study, which I have read.
I would imagine that would be beneficial to all the committee members.
We'll be able to coordinate that through our office, Ms. Pullman.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Kniezek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you for your testimony today. You began by stating that you felt that Michigan had no say in the process of developing these standards. Did I understand that correct? That no one from Michigan had a place in the work group or the feedback groups for?
No, like I mentioned with the gentleman over here, I know that there were several Michigan folks involved on those committees and that gave advice to the Common Core writers. But like I said, the Common Core writers, the people who control what went on the standards, are not from Michigan.
So Michigan did have a say in the process?
It depends on if you consider advice the same as, control, sure.
Okay. And then, as it relates to the testing, you talked a lot about Smarter Balance. Are you aware of any other tests that would be available to states to administer as a part of the Common Core standards?
You mean that are aligned with the Common Core standards?
Sure.
Yes, every single test that is in existence that I'm aware of is aligned with Common Core. The Iowa Basic, the Stanford 10, the Terra Nova test, of course the whole ACT suite of testing. There are many other ones that are not national, federally funded Common Core tests that they say match up to the Common Core standards. And
then lastly, I just want to come back to the issue of local control. And again, I'm glad we clarified that Michigan did have a say in the process. Could you discuss? Thank you. Could you discuss perhaps your understanding of standards versus curriculum? Perhaps we are setting our standards high to hold our students to a higher level, but the curriculum development itself, and you should understand this having developed curriculum for high school public speaking, the curriculum itself is maintained at a local level. Is that your understanding, that the core standards are the overarching goal, but the curriculum development itself is left to our local districts and to our teachers?
Well, actually, most districts do not develop their own curriculum. They buy it off the shelf from a large publisher like Pearson or Houghton Mifflin or so forth. So they can choose which ones they will buy, but of course the standards are the ones that give the format that all the textbooks must be in.
Thank you.
Representative Pagel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony today. It's very interesting. You criticized Common Core for its goal of helping students to be college and career ready, and state that the purpose of education is not narrow workforce development. How is it that helping students prepare for an extremely wide variety of college opportunities and an extremely wide variety of career opportunities is somehow equal to narrow workforce development?
Well, I think Common Core actually suffers from both being too narrow and too broad at the same time. So in the first case, like we've been mentioning earlier, if you're going to prepare a child for a specific job, that's a very narrow range of skills that a child needs to be, say, a lawyer or a doctor or so on and so forth. And the Common Core does not provide any specific training for any specific job such as that. So it says we're preparing children for the workforce, but the workforce consists of literally millions of positions that all have their own different qualifications. So in that sense, it's entirely too broad and doesn't apply specifically to the workforce. But in the other sense, by stating as its own goal workforce development, so to train children up to enter the workforce as economic units rather than as human beings who the reason that their education is paid for by taxpayers is to participate in self-government through their constitutionally set out their state legislature and so forth. That is entirely missing from Common Core, which is why I refer to it as narrow workforce training.
Where does Common Core state that their goal is workforce development?
If you read a lot of things about Common Core, you will never miss the phrase college and career readiness.
That's not workforce development.
Career is, as I understand, part of the workforce, and I never hear anything from Common Core folks about citizenship, about preparing a human being to be a mature adult, and so forth. We just have
that's
skills,
your
skills,
definition of Common Core, but I don't think it's their own definition of it.
Just see if you find them ever talking about citizenship. I would be very surprised, and I would like to see it.
Thank you. Representative Singh.
Yeah, I did have a follow-up to a statement that you made earlier in regards to the other tests that are aligned to the Common Core. You said that the ACT suites are aligned to the Common Core. So if a child is graduating from high school, going to college, ACT is a very common. Is this the same test that we're talking about?
Yes. Well, ACT has, of course, the college readiness test, but they have grades 3 through 11, English, math, science test that they also contract to states and school districts that they give.
Sure. So my question is, if the majority of our students as they go to college take the ACT for the college readiness portion, is that aligned to the Common Core as well?
According to ACT, it is.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Pullman, I have one question. There's a lot of the things I read about advocates or proponents or opponents, of Common Core speak to that standards-based education is unproven, that the Common Core is unproven. Yet, in lieu of those, they'll point to states with high standards. California you mentioned, Virginia, different. It can't be both.
Yes.
So which is it?
Well, to be honest, I have to say there's contradictory evidence on that point. But as far as we understand, I think the best ones are the ones done by the Brookings Institution in the international comparisons, because they basically show whether there's a correlation with high standards and high student achievement, and they find none. So we do have the example of Massachusetts, and in fact, there's been some recent evidence uncovered that California's high standards benefited students, especially minority students. But when you look at other states that do have high standards, such as Indiana, where I live, they had also, world-class, top of the nation standards, and their students are still very middling. So as I understand it, like I said, the research says that there's not much of a relationship there.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Next, we'll have Michael McShane from American Enterprise Institute.
I think this should be good. If nothing crazy happens. Looks good.
Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, and good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Michael McShane, and I'm an education policy researcher at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., though as similar to Ms. Pullman, I speak for myself this morning. I have been researching and writing about the Common Core for almost a year now, focusing primarily on the implementation issues that are related to the Common Core. If you've read any of my work on the topic, I am a professed Common Core agnostic. So I would like to say that my goal this morning is neither to persuade you that the Common Core is good for the state of Michigan, nor dissuade you that the Common Core is not good for the state of Michigan, but to simply raise a series of questions, a series of issues that states all across the country have wrestled with while implementing the Common Core standards, to give some kind of understanding of lingering questions that might exist or concerns that the people of the state of Michigan, and particularly their elected officials, would care about. And so I want to start, I should say I also began as a high school teacher. I taught 9th and 10th grade, and I often thought, every day if there was just one idea that I wanted to get across, I wanted to make sure to hit that early, get it across so I can say, and this that's projected on the screens right now is the big idea that if nothing else comes across, this is what I would like to say this morning. And that's the idea that even if the standards, if you believe that the standards are high quality, you believe they are internationally benchmarked, they are aligned to what students in Michigan need to know to be successful in life, if those standards are not implemented with care, they could end up doing more harm than good. It's important to understand that curriculum standards undergird every part of the education system. And so when you tinker with the standards, you tinker with everything that they touch. Now, sometimes tinkering is good. Raising standards, it's hard to be against the idea of raising standards. But it's important to understand how that interacts with other issues at play in Michigan, and that's what I'd like to do for the next couple minutes. And so, as I said, and not necessarily an idea of trying to persuade or dissuade, I'm simply here to raise questions, some things that I think that you should be concerned about, with the hope that actually, perhaps when I'm done with my testimony, someone who represents the state education agency will say that I'm Chicken Little saying that the sky is falling when it actually isn't. I'd be more than happy to hear that. So the first thing I want to bring up is this idea of assessments. It was something that was talked about during Ms. Pullman's testimony earlier. And I think that when we talk about assessments, it's important to understand that it's impossible to separate standards from the assessments that measure them. Standards are simply hopes on a page. Assessments are what make them real in classrooms. And so the new tests that the state of Michigan have signed on to, the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, will become the backbone for teacher evaluation, for school accountability programs, and for any number of issues in which test-based accountability is important. And so it's important to know that successful implementation of the Common Core standards will hinge on how standards interact with these assessments and how they're used in the state. And so I think there's 4 key questions that you need to ask yourselves. We need to ask folks that are working in the state of Michigan about the Common Core, especially when it comes to the assessments and how they're used in teacher and school evaluation. And that is instruction aligned to the standards? Are materials aligned to the standards? Is professional development aligned to the standards? And is teacher preparation aligned to the standards? Because if any of those things are not, the standards will most likely do more harm than good, lead to incoherent instruction, and that's really the consequences of misalignment. So if we're not teaching students what's in the standards, and we give them a test that's aligned to the standards, and the students don't do well on them, we actually don't know why they didn't do well on the test. They could have done poorly because they were taught the correct material but simply didn't learn it, or they were taught the wrong material. And depending on which case that is, drastically different policy prescriptions might arise from that. But more broadly, it's probably unreasonable to think that we could hold students, teachers, or schools accountable for information that they don't know. So the first idea is this instructional alignment. A survey was done recently by the Council of Great City Schools that found that 40% of the people that responded, so people that were working in schools across the country, estimated that less than 40% of school-level staff had sufficient knowledge about the standards to discuss implementation for classroom instruction. So we see a huge knowledge gap here. To not even talk about how to successfully implement the standards in the classroom, but even knowledge to talk about how they might interact. So the question that arises from this is to get an understanding of where are Michigan teachers on this? How much do they know about the Common Core? How prepared are they for the different sets of skills or knowledge that the standards are going to ask of students? So that's one of the first important questions that I raise. The second is the alignment of materials. So one of the great advantages, or one of the purported advantages of the Common Core, is that it opened up a nationwide market for instructional goods. So previously, Michigan schools had to purchase materials that were aligned to the Michigan standards, and that constricted the market of goods that was available for them. One of the arguments for the Common Core is that it broadly opens up the market so that now a cool app developer in Silicon Valley can develop materials that are used by students in Michigan. This is a great thing. But just last week, I went on to Amazon.com and just searched Common Core. So if I were a teacher in Michigan or a principal or someone who was looking for this great wealth of materials, and it's kind of hard to see, but if you look at the number that I circled there are actually 39,349 results that come up. So if we think about it, that's drinking from a fire hose, trying to figure out how to use these materials. But I thought, normally when I want to buy something on Amazon or use something, let's look at just number one, the best-selling work that's out there on the Common Core. It's called Pathways to the Common Core, Accelerating Achievement. It's by some professors at Teachers College at Columbia University, one of the most prestigious places that prepares teachers in America. And it's been consistently an Amazon bestseller. So teachers all across the country, this is one of the tools that they're using. So I did a little Googling about this particular work, because I, like Joy, am not a curriculum expert. And Kathleen Porter McGee, who's the Common Core expert at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, had this to say about it. It's part ideological co-opting of the Common Core standards and part defense of existing and poorly aligned materials produced by Heinemann, which is the publisher. The book is the leading edge of an all-out effort to ensure that adoption of the new standards requires very few changes on the part of some of the leading voices and biggest publishing houses in education. So this is the most popular work that's out there, and one that's being used in schools and classrooms all across the country. And those that are knowledgeable about the Common Core say that it essentially is business as usual and just is a tool to align what the publishing company is doing. What are teachers in Michigan, principals in Michigan, superintendents in Michigan, what tools do they have to wade through these 39,000 resources? What tools exist to vet these materials to make sure that they are what students need to know? So that was kind of my second question. What tools are available to vet materials? The third has to do with teacher preparation. So in order for students to learn the standards, teachers have to teach them the standards. And in Michigan, there are any number of organizations of higher education that prepare teachers. So one essential element for the Common Core to be successful and not harmful is that teacher education programs are going to have to train teachers to teach the Common Core. A recent report by the National Council on Teacher Quality reported that only 10% of the evaluated teacher preparation programs in Michigan were found to prepare teachers in the reading instruction necessary to teach the Common Core. 11% were found to prepare teachers in math instruction, and only 27% earned 3 or 4 stars in preparing pre-service elementary school teachers in the content knowledge necessary to teach the Common Core. So the question is, what assurances do you have that teacher preparation programs will get up to speed to prepare teachers to teach the Common Core? But these are actually only the new teachers that are coming in. There are tens of thousands of teachers already teaching in Michigan, and that's going to rely on professional development to bring teachers up to speed. Unfortunately, the research base for professional development and the anecdotal evidence that almost any teacher will tell you is that professional development's record is spotty at best. Recently, well, not particularly recently, but at the most recent time, the Institute for Education Sciences performed a large meta-analysis trying to collect all of the research that's done on professional development, which will, again, be a key element of aligning to the Common Core. Of the 1,300 studies at the time that studied professional development, only 9 of them met the standards for evidence that IES sets up. And of those, the only programs that were found to have a positive effect on student achievement were ones that lasted more than 14 hours. And there was a question, I think, earlier, which is where traditionally the Common Core is something that's been dealt with by the State Board of Education, or standards are dealt with the State Board of Education, and the question sort of where does this body come in? And it's that you have to pay for it. And if new professional development is going to be necessary to bring teachers up to speed, and it has to be, at least the general research consensus is that it has to be rather extensive in order to mean that could represent a very real cost to taxpayers of the state of Michigan to get people up to speed on this. But it's also the question of, will this professional development be better? The record has been spotty in the past. What assurances do you have that this new professional development to align to these standards will be superior? Now there's the ever-present issue of politics. What's an important thing to understand, and again, I should say for the purpose of my speaking this morning, I'm taking the authors and the promoters of the Common Core at their word. So when they say college and career ready, I'm taking their word for it. I'm not a curriculum expert to disagree with them for it, but let's just taking them at their word. There's a shift that's taking place, moving standards from measures of proficiency, which we would consider a more basic understanding of what students are supposed to be able to know, to a level of college and career readiness, a higher bar. So how this might play out in Michigan. So if we were to imagine this as a bell curve of student performance on standardized exams that students all across the state take. It was part of No Child Left Behind, and they've been taking for years now. Just picking a grade and subject that I did, in 2012 on the Michigan State exam, 8th grade reading, 65.7% of students were found to be proficient. So they were meeting the standards that were necessary. Now, if we were to use a higher bar that might be better understood, the Common Core exams aren't out yet, but if we were to use the NAEP, what Ms. Pullman was talking about, which is a widely recognized and respected test that's known to have a much higher standard, one closer aligned to college and career readiness. In 2011, in 8th grade reading, only 32% of Michigan students were found to be proficient, found to meet the standard. So there's this gap here. Now, on one hand, I understand the argument that it's important to raise standards, and perhaps we've been giving inaccurate information. But I think that there's a very real question when you talk to parents and when you talk to teachers and school leaders. It's what are you saying, and why should they believe you? So if a parent has a child in 8th grade next year or the year after, whichever year you roll out the tests that are aligned to the Common Core, and in 1st through 7th grade, they've been told that their child is proficient, that they've been meeting the standards. Suddenly in 8th grade, you tell them, actually, it turns out your child's no longer proficient. There's one of two reactions that I think could possibly happen. One, which Common Core advocates are fond to bring up, is that this will kind of redouble efforts for school reform. To say, actually, if we look at some of the international comparisons, we look at AP exams, maybe we're not doing as good of a job as we need to, and we really need to buckle down and turn our schools around. That is a distinct possibility, and that could happen. But on the other hand, it's quite possible that parents and teachers and school leaders will say, these tests are a bunch of junk. I think that my child, and the state of Michigan has been saying for years that my child is doing what they're supposed to, and suddenly they aren't anymore. And that runs the risk of setting back standards-based accountability, setting back all of the things that Michigan has worked hard for the last several years in terms of education reform. So what's being done to prepare the public, to prepare teachers, to prepare school district leaders, to communicate this type of information is crucially important to ensuring that the Common Core serves to accelerate these processes and not hold them back. I know my last kind of point to bring up, looking about this, is about technology. So the Smarter Balanced assessments are designed to be computer adaptive. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with computer adaptive tests, if you've taken a test like the GRE, they're widely considered to be much higher quality than the current paper pencil exams that are taken. The idea is that when students take them on computers, they can adjust the difficulty of questions, get a much more accurate representation of what students know. It's good, it's exciting. I think it's a positive development when we talk about how to use tests, but it requires infrastructure. So Smarter Balanced offers some recommendations. These aren't the minimum standards, but what they recommend for schools to have in order for students to successfully take these tests. So it needs to be a computer with Windows 7, a 1 gigahertz processor, a gigabyte of RAM, an 80 gigabyte hard drive. Students can use tablets as long as they have a 10-inch screen or larger. It could be connected to a keyboard. But then there's also bandwidth. So the tests have to connect to the internet in order to share this. And so according to Smarter Balance, it needs about 10 to 20 kilobytes per second per student tested simultaneously. And to give some idea of what that is, a standard sort of T1 high-speed internet line is about 1.5 megabytes per second, or from the school's perspective, 76 students testing at once. The test is not timed, but it offers an estimate of 2 2-hour blocks for English, 2 2-hour blocks for math. So there's some real concerns about the bandwidth, the ability for schools to cycle students through in the necessary time able to make these tests. In more rural or remote areas, states all across the country are wrestling with how to get the necessary internet access. So that's, I think, a question that needs to be asked and talked about. Is the internet access available in all areas to be able to take these tests? And is the bandwidth wide enough in order for everyone to participate? So if I were to give the sort of 3 takeaways from my presentation this morning before I happily take your questions, my broader argument, which may or may not fly in this room this morning, is not whether or not the Common Core is a good or a bad idea, but how it will interact with current efforts to improve schooling in Michigan. And just because I've raised all of these questions this morning, some of which I hope there are answers to, some of which there may not be. Just because the answers aren't there today, that doesn't mean that the answers cannot be found. That doesn't mean that people are not working very hard to rectify them. I think that's something that should be looked into. But the time is running out. The timeline's moving to implement these tests and to become integrated into Michigan's system. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
You speak of, thank you, Mr. Chair, you speak of standards as hopes on a page, and your concern is the implementation, right? We have an implementation method in Michigan education that we're pretty proud of. It's called local control. My question is, local control, we elect a local school board. They hire administrators, staff, teachers, and they hold them accountable to get the job done. And there's testing, that accountability. If they don't get the job done, we make changes on the local level. If Common Core came with all of this, with a definite curriculum, definite teacher development methods, definite textbooks to use, definite technology, would not that be totally counter to local control? How can we have it both ways?
Sure. As your question is phrased, I agree with you. Yes, that would. I guess my response would be that there are issues of capacity that local school districts run up against. So, for example, when I talked about the alignment of all the materials, so asking a superintendent in a smaller school district or a principal to try and vet all of that could be, I'm not trying to say that they aren't up to the task, but it could be very difficult to do. So oftentimes state education agencies and states all across the country will do some of that work for them to make their lives easier, and we'll provide a series of recommended textbooks and all of those from which they're able to choose. I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, part at the beginning probably did.
Not really, but if we are all shooting for the same high set of standards, then innovation towards the implementation can develop from the ground up. It can bubble up on the local level as we desire it. And when we see a school, say in Constantine, having great test results on the same test we're trying to meet, we can learn from that. Or that school could be in New Mexico. Bubbling up at the local level is where innovation should take place, and I trust our educators to be pretty good at communicating and seeing this. I don't see how Common Core is a problem in this way, but
sure.
Thank you.
Representative Yonker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You talked about, the Common Core is a standard, and we measure by, and we build education by standard. We got the Michigan Merit Curriculum right now in Michigan, and we've done proficiency tests with the MEP for a long time. And we'll have a student, like you mentioned, that'll be proficient one year, and the next year they're not. Or they'll be proficient, but yet they're going through this grade level and they can't read. Or their language arts. And I think what you hit on is probably the core problem that we struggle with, and that's our teacher training, giving the teachers the tools they need to do the job. So your points are very, very well put out there. I agree with most of them. But if you don't have a standard in a state or now they want to look at a national business standard. So we have certain subjects that are built on a standard for the nation to compete on a world market. If we don't have a standard, then what does a school teach by?
No, absolutely. So I would say I absolutely agree with the fundamental principle that you're bringing up. I've written extensively actually about standards-based accountability. I think this is a good idea. What I think the point that I was making, which I may have been not particularly clear in doing so, what I guess the point that I'm trying to make is not so much the idea of the standard itself, but the perception of the standard by the body politic. So what is being done, the question I raise is, what is being done to prepare people to say, hey, we're going to raise people to a higher standard, but it's an eating your Brussels sprouts exercise. We need to recalibrate. We need to do better. Are folks getting out in front of this and saying, hey, next year everyone's test scores are going to drop. That's okay. It's because we're using a harder test. So I think that's perhaps the question that needs to be asked is who's out there making the case for the higher standard and winning the sort of political support that's necessary so that it doesn't have the unintended consequence of people are upset with the higher standard and then they think, oh, this means standards are bad or this means we shouldn't test kids anymore or any of that sort of stuff.
Correct. Thank you.
Representative Kniezek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you for your testimony. Just very, very quick on professional development. I agree with you. We absolutely need more and more robust PD. Does that necessarily mean that we are not engaging our teachers in Michigan right now in professional development as it relates to Common Core?
I would assume that I don't know the answer. I would assume that teachers are being brought up to speed on that. Okay. Or they're in the process of attempting to.
And really that's all I wanted to call attention to. My understanding is that for the past 3 years we've been implementing these standards, and so our teachers have received professional development as it relates to Common Core, and certainly I agree with you. There is still more work to be done. But I just want to make sure everybody is well aware of the fact that our teachers have received and are continuing to receive professional development as it relates to these standards.
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
Representative Zemke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. You mentioned you had a slide on technology here.
Yes.
And there were a lot of numbers here.
Yes.
And so I'm curious, have you heard of or do you have any evidence of any particular concerns by school districts about not being able to adequately supply this technology in the anywhere near future?
In Michigan or in America?
Well, in Michigan, because I'm more concerned about
You're
Michigan
representing
right
Michigan. I have not heard of anything specifically in Michigan. I know it's been a problem in other states. Recently, just about a week ago, one of the problems was in Arkansas. Large rural areas, difficult getting internet bandwidth to them.
Okay, very good.
Representative Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of things. I agree with you. I don't think Common Core is well messaged anywhere. I can get conflicting descriptions of it. Last week I was in a meeting. A substitute teacher described it as a curriculum. So I'm in agreement with you on that. It is widely misrepresented or misunderstood. So I want to go along with your careful implementation of Common Core theme. And maybe you've expanded on this and I didn't pick it up, but can you elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by careful implementation? I know you have concerns about bandwidth and computer systems, but more specifically about the careful implementation.
So I think these are all sort of part and parcel of the broader idea of implementation. And the fundamental idea is the understanding that these standards do not exist in a vacuum, that they are aligned to they intersect with teacher preparation, with professional development, with technology policy, with schools of choice, charter schools, etc. And so when I use the word implementation, it's sort of looking at all of those intersections, and careful implementation is one that respects those different intersections and uses the Common Core to try and accelerate those efforts and not stymie them.
Representative Verheulen, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. McShane. Appreciate your testimony. Just a couple quick ones. Sure. First, so I think what I heard you say is that you advocate or think it's a good thing to have a state standard.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so that's and then your point was the importance of implementation is instruction aligned to that standard, and where are Michigan teachers and school leaders? And I've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks sitting down with folks in my district, school leaders and teachers, and they all seem to be very busy in the implementation process using the Common Core standard. And so my question to you is: Are you hearing from teachers, from school leaders in Michigan that they're not in that process? And maybe my district is not typical or consistent, but it seems like every one of my public, actually, and non-public school districts are well on the way. They're familiar with the standard. They've been redesigning curriculum, working on how to teach this way, and that seems to be, again, the consensus of what I'm hearing. Are you aware of anything different than that?
Again, the sort of survey that I cited at the beginning was a nationwide survey that talked about 40% of in 40% of schools.
No Michigan-specific data.
No, nothing that I've heard specifically from the state of Michigan.
Thank you, Doctor.
Representative Rogers, last question.
Nothing like bat and cleanup. Thank you. I appreciate that. You know, one thing that's interesting when you're talking about the expenditures, No Child Left Behind. By 2014, we're supposed to have 100% proficiency. How many schools have made it? Have you seen that, or has anybody seen that number?
A very small number.
I'm impressed that somebody actually made it. Race to the top, we've had expenditures. Michigan Merit, the goal in the mission statement, as I read it recently, college and career ready. Yet since being part of this body, it's been emphasized it's so narrow, it's only pushing towards college, and we forgot vocational ed. Is that a fair statement from what I thought I read?
I'm not particularly familiar with what exactly
okay.
what you're speaking.
And obviously in the Common Core, they're also mentioning this college and career ready. My concern is we've been down this path. How do we ensure that it really is, if that's the way we're going to go, to college and career ready? Also, we dealt with cut scores, so when you're talking about that diminishment, we did change it since we've been up here, and there was pain for a while, and many of us offered to speak to the groups and to the parents saying, we changed the rules. It was bad before, give it a little time, and then we'll be able to assess and tell you if you've got a good plan. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you all.
Next up, we'll have Dr. William Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt is professor at Michigan State University. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you, as well as the rest of the members of the committee, for this opportunity to talk to you about what I think to be one of the most important educational policy issues confronting Michigan as well as this nation. In fact, I would like to suggest it's probably the single most important policy issue perhaps of the last 50 years. So I'd like to take a moment just briefly to review why it is that this issue is so central and so important. And the economists have for many years told us that what makes for good economic growth is that we know simply that the average adult has many years of schooling of some sort. But a recent study by Eric Hanushek, a conservative economist at the Hoover Institute, showed that, in fact, when you look at this more carefully, what really is important to economic growth for the nation and for states as well is not the number of years of schooling, but it's what students know. It's what they come out of schooling aware of, what they know about mathematics and other subject matters, and that's really what is the most important element when predicting economic success. And he showed not only that is this important to simply improve the knowledge level of the more advanced students in our society and our schooling system, but also all children, so that we need to raise the entire distribution in order to achieve that advantage. This is particularly relevant to Michigan when you consider the fact that we right now rank 49th in terms of personal income growth. We're also 44th as a state in terms of unemployment. So these issues seem particularly salient to Michigan. So then what is the knowledge level if this is such an important predictor of personal success as well as the nation and the state's economic success? Well, let me review for you, first nationally and then for Michigan, some of those statistics. The international test called PISA shows that we are 31 out of 65 countries, 31 out of 65. If you simply take those nations that are all the leading economic powers in today's world, what are called the OECD countries, which incorporates and includes Germany, Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, all the major countries, that we end up to be 25th out of those 34 OECD countries, 25th. So, and not only does this PISA test tell that story, but there's a TIMSS test as well. And the TIMSS test, now some have suggested that we look like we're in the top 10 there. But the problem is that study doesn't have most of Europe in it. It also includes many developing countries, developing economies. And so when you simply move toward looking at the 20-some countries that are really OECD countries, and then ask where the U.S. ranks within that set in TIMSS, we find a very comparable result. We rank essentially about 13th out of 20 countries. So all of these studies suggest very seriously that our students do not perform, have not performed. As recently as 2011, these results suggest our situation in terms of our performance internationally. But I think something we often don't know is that even our best don't do particularly well in these international tests. If you look at our top 5%, it ends up to be in the middle of the distribution of many of these top achieving countries. If you look at the study that was done in the original TIMSS by 12th grade, our children that are taking AP calculus are near the bottom of the distribution when compared to their counterparts in the rest of the world. So the story is somewhat the same. Turning to Michigan, if you look at our own national assessment, NAEP, we are in the 2011 test, we ended up 36th out of 50 states at the 8th grade, 36 out of 50. And even worse at 4th grade, where we were 41st at 4th grade among the states. So what we have is a situation in which our performance, both at the national and at the state level, is not strong. And a recent study suggests that the performance of our students around 2000 is a really decent predictor of the economic strength of the state at the current time. So if we look at 2011 and recognize how poor that performance was, this does not bode well for Michigan's future from an economic point of view. But these international studies don't just tell us about how poorly our students do. I only review that to remind us as to the context in which these standards were developed, that we were not doing well, either by our own metric or by an international metric. But these international studies also allow us to know something about what it is that those top achieving countries do. We don't just know that they did well, we actually have information about why they did well. This is a result of a multi-million-dollar study conducted over about 5 years, which was called the original TIMSS study. In that study, we studied the standards of over 40 countries. We studied the textbooks, hundreds of textbooks from all of these countries, looking to see what mathematics education was like in different countries. One of the things we did in that work was to simply look at those top achieving countries at 8th grade, whose children did the best in the world. And we asked, what were their standards like, and how did they differ from the standards of the United States? At that time, the 50 standards, we had one for each of the states. And so we did that study. And what we found that there were several principles that seemed particularly strong in explaining the difference. Those principles were focus. We tried to do so many topics at each grade level, when in fact other countries did few and dealt with them deeply. We simply had a system that was not put together in a logical fashion. Mathematics is very hierarchical. Topics need to precede other topics because they make no sense if they don't. And so what we found we called coherence. In these top achieving countries, the logical ordering reflected the logic of mathematics. In the United States, across our states, it was a collection of topics. They were not ordered in a way that would sequence in the way to have children understand the deeper meaning and the deeper story of mathematics. We made their task much like memorizing the phone book. So the last characteristic was rigor. By 8th grade, all children in these other countries were at least being exposed to studying algebra and geometry primarily. In this country, for most of our children, it was still working with arithmetic. fractions, decimals, percents, ratios, things of that sort. So that work also led to the development of a benchmark. And I believe you have a slide in front of you that shows that particular benchmark, a handout that I gave to Chairman Kelly. It shows a pattern that reflects the focus, the coherence, and the rigor. Now, business people understand international benchmarks, and they know that this is something we need to do they need to do in order to find out what their competition is doing. So for the first time, we had a benchmark against which we could compare ourselves, as well as other nations could compare themselves. And what we found is that, as I summarized to you a moment ago, we were lacking in the kind of standards we had. Now, what those principles and that research and that work led to was a benchmark as well as a set of standards, a set of principles by which we could develop our own standards in the states. And in fact, when this work first came out, many states began to change their standards. Michigan did that. But what that ultimately led to, those principles and that benchmark, was very influential in the development of the Common Core. Now, I want to make something very clear. I am not an author of the Common Core standards. I had nothing to do with the writing of the standards. So my role in all of this was to bring research that we had done internationally to bear on the development of those standards. But let me point out to you the bit of the history as to how those standards then came into being. When those results first came out from the 1995 TIMSS study, in 1997 the results were released. There was a great uproar in the country, a great deal of upset. It made almost all the papers everywhere in the whole country. I actually have copies of them. And what this led to was a lot of the governors very concerned about the economic condition of each of their states. And so there was much discussion about what could be done. And at that time, Governor John Engler of Michigan was one of the leaders of this effort, as was Tommy Thompson from Wisconsin, and Tom Ridge, from governor of Pennsylvania at that time, Jim Hunt, a Democrat from North Carolina, Bob Weiss from West Virginia, and Romer from Colorado. Those set of governors were very concerned. And they actually charged people like myself, who had done this research, to push for some change in the system. And one of the things they wanted was the development of that international benchmark and to push states to work together towards developing standards that were truly internationally benchmarked. So the development of the Common Core began over 10 years ago. And it simply took about those 10 years to finally get to the point around 2010 where the Governors Association and the Chief State School Officers worked together to put together a set of standards, bringing together teachers, educators, mathematicians to develop these standards. So that's the history of those standards as they developed. But one of the questions that always is brought forth, and is a question that all of us want to know the answer to, is, are these Common Core standards good? Will they work? Will children learn more mathematics if we properly implement these standards? And implementation is an important issue, as the previous speaker, as I heard the end of his remarks, made. It's a very important issue. So that's the question we'd all like to know. Well, we have some evidence that doesn't allow us yet to prove unequivocally that they will work, but it does suggest that we are moving in the right track. First of all, because we had developed this international benchmark, we could compare the Common Core standards against that benchmark. Now, it's important to realize that that benchmark that you may have seen a picture of basically only represents that which is common. Common in terms of 2/3 or more of the top achieving countries holding that standard at that grade level. That was all it was. It was not a complete set of standards for grades 1 to 8, as would be the case for any one of the top achieving countries. It was only that which was in common. And what we did then is to use that and compare that against the Common Core. And what we found, using a very fancy statistical device, is that we found a 90% agreement between those benchmark standards, the international ones, and the Common Core standards. So first of all, the first response is, yes, we know we're moving in the right direction. Did we copy any countries? No, I don't believe we should. What we have done is use the standards, the principles, the benchmark by which to develop the American version. And that's what was developed, and that's what is in place. So, and now we know, though, that that set of standards are consistent, quite consistent with what internationally is the benchmark that defines excellence. So that's the first thing we know. The second thing we know is that those, and this was an interesting idea to explore, and I want to make very clear that I, as a statistician, know fully well that this doesn't prove anything. But what we took, we measured the standards of all 50 states in place prior to 2010. And we did this, used this statistical technique and looked at how close each state's standards were to the Common Core standards. The logic being those states that are the closest to the Common Core, more representative of what the Common Core would look like, should probably do better on our own national assessment than the states that are further away if the Common Core holds promise toward improving our children's performance in mathematics. So we did that analysis. And yes, we found the answer was yes, that's true. Those states on whole did better. Those that were the closest to the Common Core had the higher performance on our national assessment, our state NAEP. And what remarkably is the case for behavioral science type research is we accounted for almost a third of the variance across the states, a third of the differences among the states in their NAEP performance on that test were accounted for by just knowing the differences among those states in terms of how closely aligned they were to the Common Core standards. And so I think that piece of evidence, again, I fully acknowledge, does not prove that the Common Core standards will improve academic achievement on the part of our students, but it does indicate that we're moving in the right direction. Now, I was told as I came here today that one of the previous speakers presented some evidence by a couple of authors, Wurzman being one of them, that sort of suggests that this analysis and this work is not correct. There is something wrong with it. I actually have, in the last 2 days, seen a copy of that sent to me by the Utah Board of Education, asking me to make sense of this. And I can tell you, I'm not sure whether the authors of that simply didn't read the article that was in a referee journal, or that they didn't understand what I was trying to say in that article. But they made two serious mistakes that essentially invalidates all of their conclusions. And after this meeting, I can share with anybody the technical detail of what I'm about to say, just in summary form. First of all, the first mistake they made is they compared two things that are not comparable. They compared a full Common Core standards, which go for 1 to 8, against just the common part that we learned from the benchmark. They used figure 3 in that journal article. They should have used figure 4, which was presented, and the differences demonstrated as to what the differences between those two figures were. So they made a comparison that's not a comparison. It's not a valid comparison. But most serious, they actually committed a very common 6th grade arithmetic error. They took and divided by a denominator that was not allowing it to be a proportion. They formed a ratio and then interpreted it as a percent. And so therefore, they ended up with a completely invalid number as to the consistency between the Common Core standards and the international benchmark set of standards. They had simply used the wrong denominator. If they had used the correct one, looking at their logic and following their particular approach, what they would have found was a result almost totally consistent with what's reported in the article, that about 80-some% degree of consistency between the new Common Core standards and that of the international benchmark. The next thing I just wanted to turn to is that as these new Common Core standards have become used across the country and begun to be implemented, there are some concerns that have emerged. And I respect and honor those concerns. They are questions that need to be made forth about this. And so one of the questions that people always suggest and push back on is they say, well, we're experimenting with our children. These things are unproven. Well, it's hard to say that a set of standards that are internationally benchmarked, which are then done in some 10 top-achieving countries, and actually done in more countries as well, that those are simply experimental. They are not. These are not radical standards. They take children from understanding place value, the whole number system. They move to the algorithms of adding and subtracting, multiplying and dividing, memorizing the multiplication tables. They take to fractions. But here's a point where you can make a very important improvement. They don't introduce fractions as we have so long, which is as something that's completely unrelated to the whole numbers. But they point out that between the 0, the 1, and the 2 on the number line, there are no other numbers, and those are fractions. So it becomes connected to the whole number. They then move to, in the 6th grade, rational numbers, which is the whole of that system I just described. And then finally move to algebra, linear equations and functions, linear and nonlinear. So that progression is pretty universal across the world. This is not radically different and shifting in any strange way from what has typically been done. And one question that tends to occur to me at this point, as people push back and say, we don't want to do these Common Core standards. The question I want to come up with is, what do you want to do as the alternative? I've heard no alternatives. I only hear, this is bad, and we shouldn't do this. But where are we going to go? Back to what we have done, given what I just described to you as the track record associated with what we have done, where we do so poorly by both our own standards and international standards? So I think that's a question that should always be thought of in this context. I also want to point out to you, picking up on a question that was asked of the previous speaker, we've done a survey, both nationally and a specific Michigan survey. And the results show that over 90% of the parents, when told what the Common Core standards are, support the Common Core standards. Over 90% nationally and specifically in Michigan. There's not a lot of pushback from parents in the aggregate, at least in the broad sense of 90%. We also did the survey of teachers, who similarly are strongly behind the new Common Core standards. They find them exciting and something that challenges them in new ways. We also did a survey of the curriculum directors. They too are overwhelmingly behind this. So there's a great deal of support out there. And let me just close with this comment. I am not here as an apologist for the Common Core. The Common Core is part of a larger effort in which I have been involved in, a research effort, in which I've studied over 50 countries, looking at mathematics education, and trying to understand the relationship of standards to achievement, and what those standards need look like, toward trying to suggest how we might help our children to succeed in this world today, in this highly competitive situation. So I've studied this, and I've learned that there are certain principles by which these other countries operate. So yes, I do support and speak in support of implementing the Common Core here in Michigan, because in my considered judgment, based on that analysis and that work in all those countries, I believe the Common Core standards are a major step forward, a step in the right direction. Are they perfect? No. Nothing is perfect. I don't even know what a perfect set of standards would look like. Yes, they could be made more difficult. Some argue that. But these are reasonable standards. They're reasonably competitive internationally, and I believe they move us forward. That is what the data suggests, at least to me. Thank you for letting me have these remarks.
Thank you, Doctor. Representative Price?
Thank you. I'll try to adhere to the chair's comments that we limit our questions, but I've heard a lot of pushback against your data, that it's not rigorous, it's not sufficient. As listening to you today, I believe I'm convinced, although I don't know Tim's background, but I do wonder, I do have a question about the other countries involved in the study in particular. Mm-hmm. We have universal education here in the United States. Do other countries involved in this study offer that as well, or are we comparing apples and oranges?
Up through 8th grade, essentially it's the same everywhere. One of the requirements of these international studies is that the sampling be done by professional sampling statisticians. And countries are not allowed to exclude more than a very small, like 5-6% of their population for those children which are hospitalized or institutionalized. But basically you have to draw the sample from that. And through 8th grade, it is in all the countries that studied in TIMS and, well, PISA is 15-year-olds, but in all the TIMS countries, it's universally the case that this is the same population. These are all the children of that age attending school, which is virtually 100% of their students.
Okay. And then can you just talk a little bit about how we got to this nonlinear progression of learning in a lot of these standards? Because I do remember seeing the data that was presented. I actually attended your earlier seminar put on by Michigan State, probably back in February, and I remember that the progression did not flow, but I wondered how we got so kind of offline on that. How did we teach our children so that it didn't flow from one thing to the next?
That's an excellent question, which I'm afraid I really don't know the answer to. It appears that somewhere along the way we forgot that mathematics is a structured discipline with a particular logic that undergirds it. And so it became a collection of topics rather than a very sequenced experience for students. And you're so right in your comment. If when children don't see that storyline, that they can't see the logic of it, then they fumble and they get tired of it. If you don't mind a personal anecdote, I have a daughter, 14-year-old now. When she was in 5th grade, she broke my heart. She said, "I hate mathematics," because she had been pushed in this isolated way of learning different things. Fortunately, she's in East Lansing. They've implemented the Common Core so that when she hit 7th and 8th grade, she now likes mathematics again. And unfortunately for her, given her father's background, I watched that development, and it's good. And she now is learning the real heart and the core and the story of mathematics. And that's why having standards be coherent is so central and important.
Representative Pagel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Schmidt. We've heard a couple of quite different histories of the development of Common Core. I'd like a little clarification on that. You started in 1997 with the release of that TIMS study and the governors getting involved at that point. Earlier testimony started in 2007 with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation giving money to the Hunt Institute, who approached the governors, and then the governor report calling for national standards coming like in 2008. In your opinion, what role did these private foundations play in the development of Common Core?
I'd like to answer that question, but also another one that was implied by your question. I can assure you that the history that I described to you is the correct history. And why I can say that is I lived it. I was dragged before all of these committees with these results from the TIMS study starting in 1997 and worked personally with these governors that I mentioned and others as well. I was asked to speak to the governors' meetings. I was asked to the Republican governors' meeting. So I actually was there as a part of that history. And that's when it did begin. It took a long time to percolate to the point where actually concrete action began to take place, although during that period of time, many of the states, including Michigan, were redoing their standards along the lines of the international benchmark work that we had done. But so that is the correct history. And yes, you're right. The Bill and Melinda Gates, as a foundation, put support behind the development of these standards. It would be foolish for me to say, no, they didn't play a role. Of course they did. That money made it possible to bring together these various scholars, these mathematicians, and I can't speak to the English language arts. That's just beyond my area of expertise. But in mathematics, they brought these people together. It costs money, and so therefore, that's the only role, to my knowledge, that the Gates Foundation played, is providing the support by which this could be developed. There was no agenda on their part as to what the mathematics should look like or anything like that. That work, because I know the authors of the math standards, was based on that international research that I summarized for you.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt.
You're welcome.
Representative Yonker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for your testimony, Dr. I've been on the school board when we went to our Michigan merit curriculum and set those standards. And I was part of the process in our school district adjusting to those standards. And we never even had the teachers to a point where they could really, really master those standards where they're effective, thus the outcome of our students' testing that we keep talking about. And now we want to change the standards again, that we've already spent a lot of money in the districts. Now on the state level, there's no numbers. But I can tell you in my district, we spent $180,000. The district next to me spent $1.5 million for textbooks for these new standards. And my question is, are we going in all these different directions trying to fix a problem when our problem is, what our earlier testimony was, we're just not supporting our teachers. We're not giving our education system the chance to master the standards that we keep setting. And now yet we're changing them again. When are we going to stabilize? When are we going to have predictability? You know, teachers ask for that, and they ask for support. And I'm hearing that as I go and talk to them. And I've been through it as a board member, and it's been very frustrating. So I have a lot of reservations in yet another standard when we haven't even mastered the last ones yet.
If I truly knew the answer to your question, I could probably be elected governor. You've raised a question which has multifacets to it, but I'll try to be brief in responding to the key points. First of all, the good news. The Michigan standards that were in place prior to the adoption of the Common Core are very close to the new Common Core standards. They are one of the states that is the closest to those standards. And I know this because I had a great deal to do in influencing the development of the Michigan standards that were in place just before the Common Core. They're very close to the Common Core. So this is not a big step for Michigan. One of the things we did when we did this analysis so we could show how far states were from what they needed to be to implement the Common Core standards. And in fact, Michigan was very close. And so I think that there is a savings there as these teachers do not have to completely retool. The advantage they now have, and why maybe this is the chance to finally stabilize, is because it being national, now textbooks will be written according to the standards and not the way they have been. I suggest the district that spent $1 million probably wasted its money. There's not a serious set of textbooks out there that really are worth anything. They don't line up with the new Common Core standards. They really don't line up with anything. I tell districts, don't buy a textbook until they're about 300 pages long. 800-page 8th grade books is just a joke. And so these textbooks simply are not worth anything. And so therefore they probably did waste their money, but not because of the changing standards. So I think what chance we have with common standards, 40-some states, is the textbook publishers now need to pay attention to this. Things can now coalesce around a common set. The gentleman that spoke before me about implementation. Teachers in Michigan can work with teachers in New York, in California, in other places. There's a much greater chance for this to stabilize than what we have had in the past, which is at times, almost 15,000 different versions of mathematics for our children.
Representative Kniezek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you for your testimony, sir. Just wanted to talk briefly about your role in the development and implementation of the Common Core standards. You stated specifically you did not write them yourself, but you did provide research, curriculum, evidence that would support their development. And then, is it my understanding that you sat on the essentially validation committee?
Yes, I did.
And was it your finding that the curriculum that was, or rather the standards that were developed, were in keeping with your research and your expectations?
Yes, very clearly. In fact, the results, the data that I was summarizing was the formal analysis that I did after that meeting when the standards were finally decided upon. So yes, I do believe that they are consistent. Are they perfectly aligned? I don't know what that means, but the answer is no. Good. But they are strongly aligned and they're moving in the right direction.
And again, I think it's great that someone from Michigan had a say in that process. My second question for you is, again, I feel like I'm in an echo chamber, and I have to keep coming back to this point of differentiating between standards and curriculum. Standards and curriculum. One is the goal, the other is within the hands of our local instructors.
That's right.
And in our previous meetings, the example that was used by one of my colleagues was the lattice method within mathematics, correct? And using that as an example, or using any other example that you deem necessary, could you talk to the difference between Common Core standards and the individualized curriculum developed at the local level, such as the lattice method, that allow our students to achieve success?
I'm glad to do that. In fact, it seems to reflect somebody, I think it was you, Representative, that asked this question and made the comment about local control. All the Common Core standards do, that's all they were designed to do. There's a great deal of other things that have surrounded them, a whole other set of policy issues. But the Common Core standards merely say that these are, and I'm going to make the number up because I don't have a precise number, these are the 10 standards that you should do at 3rd grade. These are the 10 things children should learn at 3rd grade. The standards say nothing about how that's to be done. They say nothing about which books are to be bought. They say nothing about any of that. They merely define what it is that all 3rd graders should learn in order to have a progressive, coherent, progressive set of learning experiences. That's their task, is to lay that down. Now, districts and teachers themselves have all the freedom of the world to figure out how they're going to teach those standards to their particular children. They should have that. Internationally, we have this image that, like, the joke is if you're in France and it's Tuesday, you should be on page 12. Well, they have standards, but the final authority for the teaching in the classroom is the teachers in all of those countries, as it is here, as it should be. And so, yes, I know this. Humorously, this lattice. My daughter, the same 14-year-old I commented on earlier, I think it was about 5th grade, came to me and says, "What is this lattice?" Now, I have a couple degrees in mathematics, and I said, "Geez, I don't know." And then I looked at it and figured it out. It's just a device. It's a teaching technique to get kids to understand another way to look at place value, so that they recognize when they're adding and subtracting and multiplying across multiple digits that some are in the tens, some are in the ones place. That's all it is. It's not part of the Common Core. The Common Core is agnostic about the means by which it be taught. It is simply a statement of what needs to be taught. That's all it it hopes to be.
Thank you. Representative Verheulen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief.
Last question.
Last question. And it'll be a short one. And thank you, Dr. Schmidt. Just you mentioned the survey that you took of teachers and parents, and I think I heard you say that it was 90% plus approval.
Yes.
I'm just curious, do you have that summarized somewhere? Because
yes.
my experience with the teachers is they're very familiar with Common Core, but with respect to the parents, it seems like Common Core is considered the source for all kinds of negative things that may have to do with education, and I wasn't sure if, how did you educate or inform the parents what they were approving or disapproving of?
That's a very good question, and if you ask, we did this digitally, web-based, the survey, and so we could control the sequence in which they saw the questions. So we did ask them if they knew what the Common Core was. And a lot of parents just honestly don't know what the Common Core is. We then gave them the definition, the one I just gave in response to the representative's question. I simply said these are to say what, blah, blah, blah should be done at each of the grade levels. Having that simple definition, and it was just that simple, basically then the parents, yes, supports this very strongly. Over 90% nationally. And in the state of Michigan specifically, we did another survey and found that another 90% were supportive of the notion of the Common Core. And in fact, in a focus group, one parent simply said, "I thought that's the way it always was. Why is this a new idea?" So yeah, there's a lot of support. There doesn't appear to be that much pushback. The pushback we hear about may be a small proportion but a very noisy part of the population.
Is that survey, is that available?
It is.
Summarized?
Yes, we will make you aware of it. It's on the, I'm a director of the Policy Center at Michigan State, and it's the series of 3 publications about kids, about parents, and about teachers.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Then
Chairman.
we'll get that to you. If I could just really quickly say, the one thing I think we need to be worrying about that I don't know if anybody yet has mentioned is the children themselves. I think we did a survey of the kids, and we found out one really interesting finding. What they're driven by is good grades and getting to a good college, not about learning. And these standards are about learning. And so I think we're going to have to address that issue as well.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much for the time.
Next up, we have Dr. Larry Arnn, President, Hillsdale College. Welcome, Dr. Arnn.
Sir, thank you very much. I have with me Professor Terrence Moore of our history department, who is, what is he? He's a former Marine lieutenant. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago in history. He founded and ran for 12 years the Ridgeview Classical Academy, which was ranked nationally as one of the best several times. And he helps run our charter school project at Hillsdale College. And he's going to help me give this testimony because there's all kinds of things about Michigan education public policy that I have the honor not to know. This is my second visit, Mr. Chairman, to Lansing to deal with the government of Michigan, and the first one I'll tell you about it because it makes me skeptical about these state standards and about increasing control from the federal and the state governments in the details of education. When I came to the college in the year 2000, I had a 35-page letter on my desk from the Michigan Department of Education, and it was full of picayune details that nearly nobody should take the time to read. But it contained two things that were of interest, and that was they said that we violated the standard for global and multicultural curricula because we teach Western civilization. And they said that we violated the standards for diversity because we didn't have enough dark ones, I guess is what they meant. And I came up here to explain to them that the West begins with the confluence of Jerusalem and Athens, the city in which the idea of a universal philosophy for every human being was born, Athens, and the idea of one God for every man was born, Jerusalem. And so we didn't think of that as a parochial thing to study. And about that race matter that they brought up, I pointed out to them that we are probably the first college in human history, but certainly one of them, founded with a charter that says we will take black and white, man and woman all alike without any discrimination. I brought a picture that was taken, one of the most famous photographs of Frederick Douglass on our campus in 1863, and wondered if somebody from that department had compelled us to invite him. And they said, well, you know, we didn't really exist back then. And I said, well, maybe we just did that on our own then. So I worry about things like that. Since those days, we have given up our accreditation to certified teachers to teach in the public schools, although we are one of the oldest and one of the most distinguished colleges in Michigan and indeed in the country. And we do not take any money directly or indirectly from the state of Michigan as we used to do. And I don't mean to complain about any authorities in the state of Michigan who are serving now. And I will tell you that our dealings back in the days when we did receive the state aid that went to liberal arts colleges with the state government were always very friendly and cordial, and I'm grateful for that. Professor Moore and I have a few criticisms to make of this core. And to begin with, I'm going to summarize them, and then I'm going to state what a core actually should do, in our opinion. And then Professor Moore is going to talk, and then I'm going to close by saying, and Professor Moore will second it, that we should think of a new way, because there actually is an old way of government accountability that might do better than this complex way that we are developing today. I want to say a good word about Professor Schmidt, who is obviously a brilliant man and also evinces good character when he talks. He's talking about math and science, and that is not in the main where the controversies lie. It is true, and he should address this. I only read this, and we're not here mainly to talk about the math standards and don't have much to say about them. And if he thinks they're good, they probably are. But it is true that there was one member of the commission who wrote these common standards who was a mathematician from Stanford, And he repudiates the standards, refused to sign the report, and is now an enemy of these standards. And I don't know what that's about, but you should know. Now, today in education, when we teach the humanities, we are shot through with modern doctrines that sap the energy from the student and the teacher. I'll give you an example. I think it's the next but one. It's not the current, but it's the one before. If you look at the AP Guide to Secondary English Literature, and of course that's published by the College Board, and that's for AP courses, and it's the guide that's sent to students all over the country. To teachers all over the country to teach them how to teach English. The preface to the guide says that we used to teach that we knew what literature was. Now we know they're only literatures. And now objectivity and factuality are out the door. And so now we teach students to find their own reality in the text, no doubt hoping, that's a dangling participle, that they will find values to guide them through a mad, mad world. Now, if I can parse that out, I think what that means is the books don't mean anything. And so you're going to find your own reality. There is in this core, Professor Moore is going to explain it, there's an equivocation, an equivalency asserted between ordinary, common, lately written, cute stories and Shakespeare. And you'll never get a kid to read Shakespeare, and every kid should read Shakespeare. And you'll never get that to happen unless you tell them that it's beautiful. We have a really great Shakespeare teacher at Hillsdale College. I teach Aristotle at Hillsdale College, and Aristotle's difficult. It's just beautiful. One of his favorite words is the Greek word for beauty, kalon. And if you start the kid out with this statement, "Have you read this book?" and they all nod their heads and you say, shake their heads and you say, "Oh, what a privilege you're going to have. This is a lovely thing." And see what that does to a young person? It's galvanizing. Now, I will tell you, I've been sitting here for an hour, and almost nothing that has been said is about anything like that, nor any language used that should go on in a regular classroom in order to inspire and raise the soul. That brings me to the question, what is a core? And you, Representative, said a good thing. You said, it's not the self-understanding of the new Common Core that it's just about career. But it actually is the primary thing. That's what they talk about all the time. And then there's a paragraph, and there aren't very many of them, where after the thing about career and college placement, right? Now, the word school comes from a Greek word that does not mean work, it means leisure. But leisure doesn't mean idleness, it means what you do when you do the highest things that you do. It can be fierce in activity, often is. Leisure is reading Shakespeare and seeing the beauty of it, listening to Mozart and hearing the greatness of it. That's leisure. That's what school means. And see, when you're young, if you treat a student just as a, or mainly as a factor of production, the House Committee is called the Education and the Workforce Committee, right? When Margaret Spellings, in the George W. Bush administration, of which I'm critical on this point, when she launched the National Commission on the Future of Higher Education, she gave a speech, and she said we must have a great national project to catch China. And that means we have to teach these kids so they're fit to work, right? Now, first of all, isn't it true that China is able to compete with us now because they are becoming more like we used to be and less centrally controlled? And so this, and then she repeated this old thing. She said that we were able to land on the moon because after the Sputnik, we put a lot of money in education and we got ahead of the Russians. Now, the Sputnik was in 1957 or 1958, and the moon landing was in 1969. And the money started going to colleges for all kinds of subjects outside math and science 3 years later. So that means what? That means about 1961. And so what is the claim? Is that we trained a bunch of physicists in 6 years, and then after they got their PhDs, they went and put us on the moon? Or is it in fact not true? If you just look at the pictures of the people who did that they were all in their 40s and 50s, right? So it's just logical and easy to see that the aid to education had nothing to do with the landing on the moon. And we did put a satellite up just a few months after the Russians. So you see, the tone of everything is that plans made in some distant place are the key to everything. And these plans are made by people who are not teachers. And that brings me to my last, at least, point that I'll make right now. And that is, I know something about running a college. And it's a dang good college. Come and see it. It operates entirely independently, just as it has for 170 years. And I'll tell you what the key to it is. I have to get up in the morning and realize that I don't do the work. I do 1/450th of it or so. Well, you got to count the kids, right? So I do 1/2000th of it or so. I said what the word school means. The word college means partnership. Things that a bunch of people do together. What brings the unity so that everyone can work together in conversation with each other to get things done? And I'll tell you something radical, and it's profoundly true. I don't think anybody who spends much time as a teacher will sit before you and say that the key is implementation, because we are not working implements here. The truth is, if they don't work their tails off, it doesn't matter how good you are, the students do not learn. Now, this document is not written in a way to show them the beauty of the elevated things, because, of course, it is produced by an establishment that runs everywhere in the academic world outside the departments of natural science. And what this establishment thinks is that there isn't really any truth that abides or beauty that is objective. Beauty, you know, is in the eye of the beholder. So the truth is, for this movement to go in the way it is going, for more control in the actual content of what is taught in schools, that is dangerous in this day and age. And another way to go would be only a few grand goals at the top. That would be your job. Joy, back, who happens to be a student of mine, now graduated and all grown up and impressive, she quoted from the Northwest Ordinance, which was actually written in the summer as the Constitution of the United States was being written. And back in the day, when we used to remember our past, the United States Code began for about 100 years with the 4 organic laws of the United States, and the Northwest Ordinance is the third. It provides a way for the free government to grow. And there's no colonies in America. There's all these lands out there, and all these people live them, and when they come in, they're going to be equal states like the rest of it. And it gives, in all of American history, the largest subsidy to education that has ever been given. It gives 1/36 of the western land. You can go to Hillsdale, Michigan, 400 yards from the college, and see where the 16th section of that township is. And the only federal regulation that went with that great gift reads exactly this way in Article 3: religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall ever be encouraged. That's about the limit of the federal involvement in prescribing curricula. You are closer and have constitutional authority that is larger. You could be more detailed, but I urge you to think not much more detailed.
I wanted to go ahead and pick up where Dr. Arnn left off, and I would just ask you to examine what the term core curriculum means, or Common Core. Because the thing that strikes me most about this so-called Common Core is that it's not a Common Core. And anybody who's been in the field of ed reform, and particularly traditional education reform for a long time, knows that this is not a Common Core. A Common Core is a set, in the case of literature, a set of well-known books that everybody has heard of and that we all should have read that would surprise no one in this room. You could have arguments about whether you should read a longer work or a shorter work of Melville, but everybody would know you would read Melville. And so if this were a Common Core, we could be having a discussion right now about how you teach Tom Sawyer or how you teach Henry V or what have you. And that's not what's going on in all of the discussion about the Common Core. Instead, what we have is complete confusion as to what the Common Core is. And so what the Common Core does is it sets up this equivalency that Dr. Arnn was talking about between texts that were written almost yesterday and will be forgotten tomorrow, on the one hand, and great texts that have been around for a long time in English literature and will always be around. So if you look at the actual Common Core suggested readings in Appendix B, you will find, for example, that there is no Shakespeare that's taught in the middle school. Now, I've run a school, and a very successful school, in which Shakespeare is taught every year in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. But they have no Shakespeare in the middle school. Meanwhile, they suggest another text, which is supposed to teach us critical thinking, that's called The Evolution of the Grocery Bag. Now, in the market, you used to have the choice between paper and plastic. But it seems like what we're being given here is the choice between Shakespeare or plastic. And the Common Core wants us to pick plastic. Why is that? Why would they put something that no one has read in this room or even heard of on the same level of equivalency as Shakespeare or Homer or Dante or who have you? And the way that they do it is they disguise it in this part of the Common Core standards. It's called Appendix A, and they talk about text complexity. I suggest you go into Appendix A and start reading that. And if you find it difficult to understand and confusing, you're not alone. It's an entirely confusing document. But what they're trying to do is to say that what we need to do is look at the complexity of a text, and as long as a text is complex, then we should read it, and it's going to give us critical thinking skills. And therefore, we have these weird texts coming into the curriculum that normally wouldn't be there at all, like The Evolution of a Grocery Bag. Well, what's the result? Well, I think there are two results that are fairly clear in the standards themselves. There's superficiality and bias. Let's talk about bias first. In the case of the Constitution, which is something that we should all take seriously in this country, the Constitution is not recommended in the middle school. Only the First Amendment is recommended in the middle school. Can middle school students who are supposed to have this high level of achievement under the Common Core, can they not understand the Second Amendment or the 10th Amendment? Or how about the rest of the Constitution? And then you get up to the high school and you have the whole Bill of Rights recommended. So now they get all 10 amendments. Where's the rest of the Constitution? It's not in there. It's not in the Common Core. What they recommend instead are a couple of texts that give you interpretations of the Constitution. And these texts were written recently. And these texts include inflammatory language, such as vicious, masterclass, and ugly. So instead of, in our first opportunity of explaining to students what a Constitution is, what our U.S. Constitution is, instead of talking about federalism or the rule of law or the separation of powers, we have some recent scholar using actually bogus academic methods in order to come up with words that will be planted into the students' heads so that they will have a distaste for the Constitution. That will be their first experience with it. There are also huge gaps in the sorts of things that are chosen. I suggest that you look at Appendix B. When I first looked at it, I did like several people who have supported the Common Core. I said, well, there's some good titles in here, and then some others I've never heard of. But if you go through Appendix B with an eye to what a really good curriculum would look like, you come up with some strange omissions. Why, for example, is there no great text that was inspired by religion? Where is John Milton, Paradise Lost? Probably the greatest epic ever written in English. There's no mention of it. Where is, in American literature, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon that used to be read by every high school student in this country? It's not there. Inexplicably, there's nothing that is inspired by religion in the Common Core. It's as though the part of our tradition that comes from Jerusalem simply doesn't exist. What else doesn't exist? Ben Franklin's autobiography used to be read by every student in this country. I know that because I found my grandfather's copy of it in the notes that he made when he was in high school. Benjamin Franklin's biography, not even a selection, is in the Common Core. And in fact, there's no mention of Franklin anywhere. Not as his satire, such as how great empires might be reduced to a small one. That used to be read by every high school student. It's not in there. Even Franklin's scientific experiments on electricity, which were the greatest of the day, that are the foundation of electricity, are not in there. It's as though Benjamin Franklin didn't exist in the eyes of the Common Core. Now, I know what the Common Core would say. They would say, we're not dictating curriculum. We're just giving you these standards, and you can interpret them however you want to, Michigan, and you can implement any books you want to in the classroom. Now, anybody who believes that has not spent any time around public schools over the last 20 years. Because the rule of public schools is he who controls the tests controls the curriculum and controls the teaching of that curriculum. And so by choosing particular texts that will then make it into as in these exemplar texts that they have, and by all the other things that Mrs. Pullman was talking about that are going to come into place to tell you exactly what the high quality informational texts are that they want you to learn, whatever is in that list of texts will make its way into the curriculum. Anything that's not in that text, in that list, will not make its way into the curriculum. And then so Orwell, Animal Farm, which is also not in the core standards, it will be forgotten as far as it comes to American high school. Now, I want to say one other thing about what it looks like to be in a classroom. I want to read to you from a sample performance task that you would find. It's in Appendix B. I didn't make this up. This is the way that you would talk about a work of literature according to the Common Core standards. This is referring to the famous fence painting scene out of Chapter 2 of Tom Sawyer, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And this comes straight out of the standards. Students summarize the development of morality of Tom Sawyer in Mark Twain's novel of the same name and analyze its connection to themes of accountability and authenticity by noting how it is conveyed through characters, setting, and plot. This is something that's supposed to be done by 6th or 8th graders. Now, when you first hear that, you think, wow, that sounds really complex. I bet the kids are really going to develop their critical thinking skills with that. There are only a couple of problems with it. Number one is this is totally boilerplate. This is what happens when you take one of the standards and apply it willy-nilly to a work of literature. This same standard, this same question could be asked of The Ugly Duckling, or it could be asked of the Brothers Karamazov. It doesn't matter, because when you're dealing with standards, you just apply stuff willy-nilly. It doesn't come out of the work of literature itself. But on top of that, anybody who knows Tom Sawyer and who loves Tom Sawyer knows that the words authenticity, morality, that's not what Tom Sawyer's about. Authenticity? That's a 20th century term that we use to describe ennui that we have in our dilapidated age. This is not Tom Sawyer. He's one of the most authentic characters that you can find in literature. Even when he's lying through his teeth, he's a perfectly authentic character. So this is a question that's developed by a standard. What do you think it would do with the kids who are sitting in their classroom who now all of a sudden have to consider Tom Sawyer in terms of his authenticity? I tell you what will happen. They'll be bored to death. And the teacher will be bored to death because her job is now forcing Tom Sawyer into this construct to try to figure out what's going to be on the test. The other thing that is true is that if you count up the number of texts that are going to appear on these tests, you know that what's going to happen is they're not going to read complete works of literature anymore. Because the testing game is trying to figure out which snippet is going to appear in this 5 or 6 minutes that are going to be given to the exact work of literature on the test. And so these textbooks, which are currently being created, they're about yay thick and cost about $120 a piece. They're all going to contain little snippets of literature, and no story will be read all the way through. Now, in fairness, I'll give you what I think would be a good question about Tom Sawyer. Tell me if you like this one. Did Tom prove that there is more than one way to skin a cat or to paint a fence? Which is better, Aunt Polly's way or Tom's way? Why? What talents are necessary to get a fence painted Tom's way? Does Tom reveal any qualities that could be considered heroic? What else do we learn about Tom and Tom's world? What words best describe Tom? Now, as a 12 or 13-year-old, which question would you rather go into a discussion about Tom Sawyer asking? This or the one about authenticity? Which is an authentic representation of what Tom Sawyer really is? Well, I know because I've seen students talk about Tom Sawyer at the 5th grade level. And I know the kind of vibrant discussion you can have with fifth graders talking about Tom Sawyer, you're doing it this way. And I have seen the tedious, boring, contrived, boilerplate discussions you have about talking with Tom Sawyer the other way. The choice is the state of Michigan's.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Zemke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to address both of you at once because you're both here representing the institution of Hillsdale College. I'm just curious. Well, first of all, I have to say I was a little bit distracted by your introduction, sir, your choice of words. I find them offensive. It's your right to say them, but I'd like to make my claim.
Which one,
to that.
sir?
The dark ones comment in particular.
Well, isn't that the point, though, right? Our charter says in 1844, we will accept all who wish without regard to race, sex, or national origin.
I said I find your choice of words offensive.
Okay.
My question, however, after I collected my thoughts, was really based on kind of both of you. There's a number of statements made in your document here, your testimony, Dr. Moore. Where's the evidence to support a number of these? You cite Appendix B in some of them, but you have 3 pages of statements here, some of which make wild claims, or drastic claims at best. Where's the evidence to support these claims?
Which claim is wild?
You have several here. The Common Core is an unpredictable, unaccountable moving target. It authors in the introduction promise of a living work and will be revised whenever the new evidence emerges.
Sure. First page of the introduction. This paragraph right here, it says, mastery was essential for college and career readiness, so on and so forth, globally competitive society. The standards are intended to be a living work. As new and better evidence emerges, the standards will be revised accordingly. You know what that means? Those of us who've studied what a living constitution means, that means that we get a government that the Founding Fathers never intended and that you all have sworn on to as elected representatives of Michigan. What it means in terms of education is the thing that you're voting on could become very different tomorrow, and it'll be totally unrecognizable 5 years from now.
I think that's your opinion rather than supportive evidence.
Okay, well, we have a whole history of educational fads that have gone that way.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Representative Kniezek.
I'm really glad you used the term ugly language because I'm going to echo what my colleague said and say that I was equally as disappointed with the dark ones comment. You're the president.
Can I say something else?
No, you're
about
the
that?
president of a college. I would expect better out of you. Now I'm going to go back to some.
Can
of
I
the
say
comments.
something else about that?
I'd just like to ask a question. Thank you.
Please do. Yes, sir.
We're talking about the reading list, and so I'd like to read from the Common Core Standards ELA for 9th and 10th grade. Analyze seminal U.S. documents of historical and literary significance, e.g., Washington's farewell address, the Gettysburg Address, Roosevelt's For Freedom speech, Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, including how they address related themes and comments. Being a lover of the classics, you know that E.G. stands for exempli gratia, for example. So, again, I find no evidence that shares, or states, rather, a required list of books. I think it's ironic, however, if we hadn't provided a list of books, we'd be getting criticized for that. And then again, nowhere on the test, the Smarter Balance or any of the other 3 tests that are available, does it require any of the testing based on those texts. Again, to you, sir, and again, I thank you for your service as a Marine myself. The Common Core concerns that you have regarding maybe some of the civic documents, the Constitution, etc., do we not have Common Core standards only for math and literature at this point, and perhaps the social studies where I would expect some of that curriculum to come into play has not been developed yet?
Well, that's kind of funny, don't you think? That we don't have any kind of standards for social studies, because there was an attempt to impose social studies standards a ways back, and of course the standards ended up being so biased that there was opposition, and that went south. So in this set of standards, we're adopting things that should be somewhat less political, But don't you think that once the states buy into these standards and the whole testing regime is set up, that those next standards are going to be forthcoming, and that they're going to betray the same very biases that I just expressed when looking at the way that the Constitution is treated in front of our very eyes in Appendix B?
So you think the Common Core standards have a liberal bias? Is that your concern?
I would call it progressive. I don't know that I'd use the term liberal because that means freedom.
Okay.
But yeah, definitely, you can look at where they're getting their different things. I think it has an anti-religious bias. I think that it has a progressive bias. I think that it doesn't look too much to the foundations of this country. And I think it has a strange bias against reading entirely complete works of literature, because that's what's going to end up happening.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
President Arnn, I don't wish to make this a discussion about race and therefore, but if you would want to clarify your remarks.
The state of Michigan sent a group of people down to my campus 3-4 weeks before I arrived there as the new president with clipboards to walk around and look at the colors of people's faces and write down what they saw. Because we don't keep records of anybody's color. We never solicit that information. We never written it down. What were they looking for except dark ones? That's my point.
Thank you. Representative Singh?
I guess I want to get back on target for the conversation today, because obviously the point has been missed that my two colleagues have brought forward. When you talk about the federal side of this, I think we're all in agreement that the federal government is not pushing this, and it wasn't started by the federal government. Would that be correct?
Well, my understanding is the federal government had a whole bunch of money that rewarded states that adopted these standards. So to say that the federal government is totally out of this, I think, would be inaccurate.
And then when you take a look at the state constitution and the ability of the Board of Education to approve these standards and then future standards, are we all in agreement that our state constitution provides that ability for that body to take a look at state standards and adopt whatever state standards they see fit?
You're asking whether the states could?
Our state constitution, yes.
Okay, sure.
So you do agree with that?
I guess what you're asking is, does the state have the right to adopt the Common Core standards?
The constitutional authority, and the answer is my answer is probably it does, but I don't actually know.
Representative Price?
I'm just a little. I am looking at Appendix B, and I have tried to look through all of the standards, tried to read them. I am not an expert on curriculum at all, but for instance, looking at the grades 6 through 8 text exemplars, informational texts, John Adams' Letters on Thomas Jefferson. Frederick Douglass, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Winston Churchill, Blood, Toil, Tears, and Sweat. I'm confused as to why, and there are never, Shakespeare, here's Shakespeare. So I'm confused about why you're mentioning that these great works of art, and one of my favorites is in here, Travels with Charlie. Why you're saying they're not included? That's what I want to ask.
Here's what's happening. If, as I stated, perhaps not as specifically as I could, if you had a thing that was a Common Core, you would have nothing but those works in here. That's the way the English used to be taught. And I'm not referring to history and other things at the moment. And you used to read complete works of literature. That was understood. So it's not surprising that there are some good works of literature in here. What's surprising is they're taking other things that we've never even heard of, and they're elevating them to an equivalency of those great works of literature. And they actually use a phrase in the document which is equivalent literary merit. How do you have the equivalent literary merit of Homer if you've just written some recent article that's published in 2008? Has that been tested yet? And so what you find is there are a couple of things going on. One is they're putting things into an English curriculum that normally wouldn't be there. And they're going to be in English books. And these books are being created right now, by the way. They're already in the schools. And any English teacher can tell you right now that we're teaching more nonfiction than fiction. That's the way that they put it. When I went and toured the schools in 2011, this is what I found. All the English teachers told me we're teaching a lot more nonfiction these days. So even what's suggested here, I think that's the promise. I know that that promise is not being delivered. But the other thing is that as you crowd out that literary canon that we would expect to be there, that's in part how I think they're getting the thing sold, fewer and fewer complete works are going to be read. And the seriousness by which these works are taken is going to go away. And what you're going to have is you're going to have this regime of trying to figure out what's going to be on the test. And what kind of quick decision can we make on this particular test that we see in a given day? And then we go on to a next test the other day. Let me give you an example. Okay, here's an example of critical thinking that I've seen in a Michigan school based on a textbook last year that was heading in the direction of this Common Core stuff. It was some little vignette about how seeing eye dogs are trained. So it was a one-page thing that the kids read. They were fifth graders. And so the teacher went through, read to them what seeing eye dogs, how they're trained, and she got to one point in the text and she said, "Now why does the seeing eye dog stop at the red light?" That was her question. Why does the seeing eye dog stop at the red light? Well, no one in the class said anything. The obvious answer is so that the lady who is holding on to the seeing eye dog, who is blind, so she doesn't get run over. This is supposedly critical thinking all of a sudden for 10 or 11-year-olds. But nobody responded to that question. Do you know why? It's not because they didn't know. It's because they were bored to death. That's not what literature is. That's not what life is. The reason we study literature, and the reason that it should be studied in isolation and not with all these other texts coming in, is because literature teaches us two things. It teaches us language, and beautiful language, as Dr. Arnn was talking about, and it also teaches us about human beings. And we've had a lot of questions here about a 21st century global economy and all that sort of stuff, and whether we're preparing people for the workplace. I would wager that if you ask any CEO in this country, and certainly in this state, what his major problems are they technical problems, or are they personnel problems? What are the hardest things that you always have to do? It's always dealing with people. Literature equips you to understand human beings, and therefore able to deal with people. And that's what's going to be lost if this thing actually goes into place.
Yes, go ahead.
So I will give you an example. Yesterday I met with the curriculum director of my local school district, West Ottawa Public Schools. Large migrant population of kids. And it is very difficult to teach, I think, a group of kids coming in on a sporadic basis, possibly. Now I like Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare. I love it in all its forms, modern, old, whatever. It's hard to teach kids that. They did show me a book that was written about a migrant boy and his daily life and how he has, how his family works, how hard they work. And to me, that seemed like an appropriate tool to engage children in learning and reading, especially if they're in that migrant population. They're going to have more identity with that literature than possibly Shakespeare.
Ma'am, I hate to, because I know you didn't mean it this way, but what you basically just said is that migrant populations, i.e., I think Hispanics, can't read and love Shakespeare.
No,
and I know you did not mean it that way.
No, that's not what I meant. I meant they would have more possibly fun reading about their own lives, like I do, or something that interests them and they understand more.
Let me give you an anecdote which would be followed up by our professor we referred to, who is the Shakespeare expert at Hillsdale College, and he's known around the country as a Shakespeare expert. After he got out of his undergraduate, he went to teach in the Bronx for a couple of years. And everybody told him, all these experts told him, and all these people who are running schools, that your kids won't like Shakespeare. And he taught them Shakespeare, and they loved it. And for the first time in their public education, they were not bored. And it's an unfortunate story, but the origins of progressive education, which go all the way back to the early 1900s, and they were fomented by somebody whose name is John Dewey, who took over Teachers College Columbia. All of those early dialogues about progressive education were based in the idea that all these new immigrants who were coming into this country right around 1900, Italians, East Europeans, that they could not study the regular good stuff that all the kids who had been here for a long time, the Anglo folks, had been reading. And so it started out as a diminution in expectations of what human beings are.
I'll add to that. I used to be 25 years ago. I used to know very well and try to help Marva Collins, who ran the West Side Preparatory School, and she is an amazing woman. And her daughter lived with my wife and me for weeks one time because they wanted to learn how to manage an organization. Her idea in the west side of Chicago, with almost exclusively minority kids, was that they should read great books. And they should read them till they could see why they were great. And, of course, it was a stirring story. I once saw her walk up to, and see, that means, by the way, that education has to point up, right? And we're supposed to climb, and it's harder to go up than it is to go on level ground. So I once watched her walk up to a little girl who had her head down on her desk, and she put her thumb right here and picked it up and said, "If you sleep in this classroom, you're going to be lost. And this is great stuff we're learning right now." And she had these big, beautiful eyes, and the little girl was just, this great. So what we think is Shakespeare is famous for a reason, but not only he. Terence mentioned Milton and all of them, and what's great about great books, if they're great, and here's the great books don't agree with each other, so the trained mind knows how to navigate through that and figure it out for himself. But if a book is worthy of the term great, whenever it is written, it is worthy because it deals in a deep or high way with the human experience. I mean, look in Shakespeare, every kind of situation arises: religious, racial, aristocratic, the claims of the demagogues. Everything is in there. Everything human beings do, in the same way that it's in Dickens, for goodness sake. So if you, and that's why you go to school, because in each step, in the way schools work when they work the best, in our opinion, that's what we came to give you. And I'll remind everybody, we don't have any stake in this, right? We're not regulated by the Michigan Department of Education or the Federal Department of Education. We were asked to come. And we're going to go back, and I'm not going to come back to Lansing for 13 years. But the point is, there is a thing to love, and that is the ascent that goes from where you are today to where you are when you are a fully capable human being, living as human beings. And it's actually the case that nearly everybody, nearly everywhere, of nearly every station, and when I say nearly, I mean only people who suffer some impairment can't do it. They can benefit from that. And anybody can read Shakespeare and find love in it.
Representative Verheulen.
Yeah, very, very briefly, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here. I just have to comment also on the comment about, and I think, Mr. President, you said cute story and Shakespeare is sort of equated in the standard, my words. But when I looked at just the 6 through 12 text illustrating the complexity, quality, and range of student reading, I see Shakespeare, Keats, Orwell, Thomas Paine, Steinbeck, and John Adams. So I think it's a little disingenuous to say that the classics are undermined. But my point really is this. As I said earlier, I'm a believer in local control, and I think that these standards don't dictate or ought not dictate specifically what textbooks are used or how curriculums are developed or specifically what the teacher says in the classroom. And so I share some of, perhaps much of your concerns about education in general, but the question before us is, do these standards, it's whether these standards are quote, better or less, not whether they match some ideal of what education ought to be. And that's what I'm struggling with. And I guess I come down to, when I discuss something like this, I said, well, what is your alternative? What do you propose? I know that there's fault found with Common Core. We've heard great fault found with the prior standard. And I think we all share some of your concerns about the failings of education of our young people, but we can't simply say, well, we're not happy with we find fault with something. We have to find something concrete and specific, and I have not heard anything concrete and specific short of saying this is how you should address this John Steinbeck book. But I don't think it's our role as a legislature to tell a teacher in a classroom in my district or any district in the state of Michigan specifically how to teach John Steinbeck. So my question to you is, what do you propose other than you don't like Common Core?
Thank you, sir. That's an excellent and incredibly difficult question, and I see where you are. I've studied the Constitution of the United States for much of my life, and here's what I think. I think that there are two, and this is such a big thing, right? And I'm apologizing that
I don't. The Constitution issue and the data privacy issue, let's put that aside because I have some of those same concerns. But just on the merits.
I'm going to give you it used to be that the rules and the laws that were made at the state government and the federal government both were short and simple. And they had the tone and the quality of high goals. This thing that you're talking about is incredibly complex. So it's very hard. I don't know it. Terrence is here because he knows it better than I do. And I've been reading it for a week because somebody asked me to come and do this. But Terrence knows it in and out. And so it's very complex. Find something simple to do. Something you can write on 2 pages. That's how they used to do it for a long time. And I would, if it were me, I would do charter schools. I'd do, we got a lot of them in Michigan. I'd take the cap off and do a bunch more. And see, these are only general guidelines. One more thing. The systems of accountability, they've been discussed a lot here before we started talking and disrupted things. I guess I don't apologize about that, but we did disrupt things. The systems of accountability, what people don't mention enough is parents, because they're the ones who really care. And they're, in my experience, and I know a lot more, by the way, because what do I do for a living? Twice a year, I have nearly 1,000 parents show up at Hillsdale College and meet the professors and meet me. They care deeply, and they're smart. And so we've got this image that unless we explain it to them, they can't understand it. And that's a new thing. That's only 50 or 80 years old in American history. And I don't even think it's true. So my concrete proposals, such as they are, find something simple to do.
So you would not, we had several other witnesses this morning say that a state standard is appropriate. Would you say it's not appropriate, or would it be a state standard that we could encompass in 2 pages?
That's it. And that's it. And see, by the way, I'm an advocate of the Constitution of the United States. What that means is the Constitution of the United States was written to make a more powerful central government than the one we had, because states were oppressing people's rights, and so I'm all for that. And I understand, I just quoted you the Northwest Ordinance, which gave, I said, the largest subsidy to education that's ever been given. I'm not talking about doing a different thing. I'm talking about doing a thing in a different way, a different kind of way. And if I were a public official, I would spend a lot of time looking for that. I would find ways to make the system, like I do like the idea of clear standards. I don't think these are clear. I like the idea that you empower the parents and the teachers. I went to public school. My father was a public school teacher in Pocahontas, Arkansas, all his life. And go watch a Western movie. A teacher, when they appear in one, is always a symbol of wisdom. We've been training teachers at Hillsdale College for 170 years, and what did they do? They went to their community and they spread learning. And in 1850, you had to know Latin and Greek to get into Hillsdale College. Our standards have slipped. Now, today, what's a teacher? The term is deliver content. They're like a conveyor belt. And instead, they should figure a lot of this out, and you should give some clear statement, but simple. And that's a big order, right? I can't do it right now, and I've been studying this stuff all my life. So I sympathize and wish I could help you more. And if you ask me to, I'll work on it. You know, we do work on that kind of thing at my place, and try to be of service. But shouldn't we be on a massive effort to simplify the government and include more people in it?
I could say something about standards if you want me to, sir. Do you want me to follow up?
Go ahead.
Okay. I ran a school in Colorado, which, as Dr. Arnn told you, was a high-performing charter school. Twice it ranked as the highest high school in the state. It was always in the top 3 from its inception. And we had to take the state tests, and so we had these state standards. Colorado is very proud of its state standards, and I'm sure the way Michigan is proud of theirs. And what they did is they sat on a bookshelf. And never once did I take down the state standards and look at them. Never once did I have my teachers take down the state standards and look at them. Why? Because we were too busy teaching Shakespeare and Tom Sawyer and these other great books. What goes on in most public schools, though, certainly those that are not classical charter schools, is that teachers, and you can ask these teachers, are required in making up lesson plans for every single lesson that they do to spend hours and hours going to the state standard and showing how every moment of the day is somehow fulfilling some sort of state standard, which is nothing in the world but taking some boilerplate thing and applying it, often just indiscriminately, to a part of the lesson. And when we help start charter schools around the country, and the first thing we tell them is, we want a syllabus from you, and then we're going to talk about how we teach those books, and you're not going to have to make these canned lesson plans that go in a file and nobody ever looks at. You can't believe the sigh of relief that they breathe. That's the reality for teachers in Michigan and in America.
Representative Yonker?
Oh, sorry.
Last question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this will be appropriate for the last. Thomas Jefferson education, boilerplate or conveyor belt education. Very familiar with that book. I'm sure you guys are as well. But let's look at reality. I grew up in a parochial private school. My family never seen a Shakespeare book sit on the cupboard or the table in our house. Maybe that's why I am the way I am today. I don't know. But I supposedly had one of the best education systems to go to. Shakespeare hit our household when my kids went to the public school. It's the first time I seen it. First time I even was familiar with what was in it. So it goes back to, again, what we've been talking about by several of us. It's local control. Now, those same schools that I graduated from, elementary all the way through high school, are on me big time to get this Common Core accepted into our state. They're using it. And you're a college. You do your own thing the way you can, the way you want. But as a state, we have a constitutional obligation for every one of our children. And we have to make sure, not like I experienced, where there was no standard. And I struggle. I had to re-educate myself afterwards, and we paid a lot of money for that education. We owe it to us to have a type of standard because we have a general knowledge that we all have to have. We can't, in K-12 education, go and give expertise in all different fields. That is what these business people did when they started this process. That is the thought process that Gates Foundation carries. They're looking at the country as a whole. They use private money. And that's what we're all about. We can't have the government do it. We did it as a private entity with all the right intentions. Now, I want better for my grandkids than I had growing up. So if you can explain to me why a standard is that bad, and give me good evidence that can outdo what my life experience and my kids' experience is in education, then I'm willing to think different.
I could say a couple of things. First of all, we just had a training at Hillsdale College, which is a training for future principals and school leaders, some in charter schools, but we had some folks from the Michigan public schools as well. One a graduate of Hillsdale. I'm not going to tell you who it is because it'd probably get him into trouble. But he's in a position where he's essentially overseeing curriculum, and he's doing things within a district that is getting back to a true Common Core. But they've seen the Common Core coming down the pike. And 5 of the teachers who are the most experienced, and they're the kind of tough teacher who really believe in grammar and really love books, 5 of those teachers who have shut their door to every fad that's been going on for the last 30 years that they've been teaching, they retired because they said the Common Core is obviously the one that we can't fight. So they took early retirement. That's 5 to 10 years you're not going to have those teachers. Okay. Now, the word standard is a funny one, right? Because you can insert it in there, and if you say, well, we don't believe in standards, it's like you don't believe in education. You don't believe in having some kind of hierarchy or standard. I don't think that's what we're saying. What we're saying is that these contrived boilerplate standards that are frankly created by bureaucrats in order to fix certain books, which means fix certain human experiences into some sort of prototype that we think we can mass process, that's not the way to do it. We're not saying that we shouldn't teach books, and we're not saying that there shouldn't be some sort of standard. But frankly, these standards, they've just been lifted from the states. The real action that's going to go on in the Common Core is the text that they're going to recommend that are currently in these appendixes, and now that these other groups are starting to work on, that's what's actually going to happen. The standard is the Trojan horse, because we're supposed to sit back and say, well, we love these standards. We're going to have kids actually reading books in the 5th grade. Who could argue with that? What's going to happen is really the text selections and the minimalization of true literature. And for that matter, one other thing that I'd say in conjunction with Dr. Arnn, all of the pressure in this, if you go back and read Appendix A, where they talk about complexity and how we need to have articles and latest articles that are written, and that's because college professors assign articles and all the rest of it. If they really wanted young people reading complex texts that would really train them in what we call critical thinking skills nowadays, why wouldn't they insert some Aristotle or some philosophy? Why would it be this latest stuff that's just been written? See, we read philosophy at the college level, but it can be read, I tell you, at the high school level, and that's not what they're in the business of doing.
Thank you for your testimony. Thanks, gentlemen. We have this room for another 5 minutes. There's another committee. I know several of you have traveled here to speak. I will there's 4 people here that have put cards in that they'd like to speak. You have 1 minute. There won't necessarily be any questions from us. So have at it. Karen Braun with Stop Common Core.
Thank you. And just really briefly, to the question about workforce development and how that's in the Common Core, Governor Snyder pretty much admitted it himself when he said we have to stop thinking of education as K-12 and start thinking of it as P to 20. P stands for prenatal. 20 is the 4 years post-college, which is the career aspect of it, and then everything in between. So the child is prenatally tracked going forward to the 4 years post-college. That is workforce development, cradle to grave. And to the statement about the Constitution, I believe it was you who asked that question. The Constitution says that the Michigan, I believe it's the Department of Education, the State Board of Education shall advise the legislature as to all financial requirements in connection with their decisions. That's in the Michigan Constitution. I don't know that that's been done. I've asked a couple of legislators and their aides whether or not that a cost analysis has been done, and that the Michigan Department of Education has advised your body as to the cost of Common Core with the assessments. I don't think that that's been adequately investigated, let alone advised. And to the third question of curricula, Professor Schmidt appeared last year at the National Press Club with Mike Cohen, who testified here at the last hearing. Mike Cohen specifically said at that press briefing that 3 states are right now piloting the tools and curricula by which states will then be able to address their curricula and decide whether their curricula is Common Core based. So I would acknowledge that right now the Common Core does not have a curricula. They're correct in that. However, Achieve is behind those 3 states. Mike Cohen is the president of Achieve, he ought to know, and their desire to take this to the next level. Social studies standards, the C3 standards, are being developed right now, as are the next generation science standards, so we've moved forward in that way as well.
Thank you. Mary Beth Schmidt, trustee, Salem Township.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak after listening to all of this. Normally I'm where you're at in my township, so I empathize with all the information you're getting. I would just encourage you that while you're sifting through all of this, I really like the idea of keep it simple. Standards are great. Keep them simple and give a lot of freedom and a lot of choice to the parents and the teachers in how their children are educated. The standardized testing, whatever is on that, that's what's making or breaking our kids' chances to get into college. So we have to be very inclusive with these tests. There's a lot of different worldviews out there, and we're competing fiercely for this kind of material to line up with how we think, and it gets very complex in our society. So I would just encourage you, keep it simple and give the most opportunity for local control to the parents and the teachers, and I think we've got a win-win. Thank you.
Thank you. Pasquale Battaglia, American Classical Academy. Very quickly.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. I'm going to give you a little different perspective, and I know you're all stakeholders in this game. I'm sure you all have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews. We're all on the same page as far as we want what's best for our children in the future of Michigan. But I want to change your perspective a little bit, and I want you to look at the history of Michigan education and United States education. We've been going downhill. And we've been going downhill fast. Now, we have some major stakeholders in the state of Michigan who lead the Department of Education that have helped shepherd us down that slippery slope. Now we're relying on these same people who have taken us in that direction to come up with some new and revised concept of education? Really? We have 2,500 years of classical educational success that has been tempered, and it's being delivered in this state better than any place else in the country, and I dare say the world. Now, you just had a tremendous offer from the people that have been delivering it better than anybody else. Why don't you take them up on that? Put a hold on this. Look at something that's been working for hundreds of years versus taking us another, I hate to say it, they're putting a new ribbon and some perfume on the same pile of fertilizer, okay? Let's try to do something that has worked and it has a history of working.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ruth Ann Knapp.
As someone who has worked with piles of fertilizer for 40 years in the classroom, 40 years plus, and I am now on a school board, let me give you my take on Common Core state standards. We are in a race.
Ma'am, we have to give up this room very quickly. Are you for or opposed to Common Core?
I am very much in support of Common Core state standards, and I can read fast.
Okay.
All 50 states start with race cars. Some are stock cars, some Indy models, and others Model Ts. A number of them decided on a Common Core. Thus, we have the Indy cars racing. All of them proceed preparing for the race, tune-ups, tires, fueling, etc. Drivers, the teachers, are prepared with training and the best practices on the track. Now, one owner decides to no longer gas up the entry. We need funding for Common Core state standards. How do you think the race will turn out? The kindergartners who started in the 20th century are graduating in the 21st century this year. We can't wait. Thank you.
Thank you. Melanie Curtis. Okay, thank you. These I'm going to read in are opposed but do not wish to speak. Norman Sturchill, Russell Lapham, Connie Lapham, Patricia Schonover, Michelle Gray, Rebecca Schonover, Shady Gray, Kathleen Klump, and Chatone Berry. I appreciate your attention today. Thank you for your patience. Our next meeting will be August 14th here in this room beginning at 10 a.m. Thank you again.